On the night of our 10th wedding anniversary, my father-in-law spent the entire evening insulting me in front of everyone. But the moment I finally found the courage to speak back, my husband slapped me hard across the face, in front of 600 guests. Everyone laughed. I wiped away my tears, walked away without a word, and made exactly one phone call. "Dad, please come." Before I tell you the rest of this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to stand up to a family that underestimated your worth, hit like and subscribe. This one's for you. My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. For the past 10 years, I have worked as a historic real estate consultant, a quiet profession that demands patience, precision, and a deep respect for the past. I prefer simple clothes, simple routines, and a quiet, unremarkable life. My husband is the exact opposite of everything I am. He is 35, the vice president at his father's wealth management firm, and he lives for the spotlight. Preston thrives on tailored suits, imported luxury cars, and the constant hungry validation of his peers. Tonight was the undisputed pinnacle of his social calendar. We were attending the 10th anniversary gala for his father's investment fund, held at the most exclusive country club in the entire state. The grand ballroom was an ocean of crystal chandeliers and towering floral centerpieces that must have cost a small fortune. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays stacked with flutes of champagne. 600 of the most influential people in the city filled the room that night: politicians, corporate titans, local celebrities, and everyone eager to be seen among them. I stood near the main dining table, quietly nursing a glass of sparkling water. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue gown I had bought off the rack, nothing custom, nothing extravagant. I felt perfectly at ease with myself, right up until the moment I looked toward my in-laws. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, held court near the center of the room, radiant and untouchable. She wore a custom designer dress that cost more than my very first car, and her neck was heavy with diamonds that caught the light with every small movement. Beside her stood my sister-in-law, Camille, dripping in an almost theatrical display of jewels, each piece clearly chosen to be noticed. Camille was accompanied, as always, by her husband, DeAndre. DeAndre is an African-American corporate lawyer who handles all the delicate legal maneuvering for my father-in-law's firm. He stood off to the side that night, calmly nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, quietly calculating every social interaction unfolding around him. I tried my best to remain invisible, hoping the night might somehow pass without incident. But in this family, my mere presence was treated as an offensive disruption to their carefully curated world. Then my father-in-law, Richard, stepped up to the main podium. The string quartet fell silent, and a heavy hush settled over the massive ballroom. Richard tapped his crystal champagne flute lightly with a silver spoon, instantly commanding the attention of all 600 guests. He looked out over the crowd, his chest visibly puffed with pride. "Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate a decade of unprecedented growth and prosperity," he began, his voice echoing confidently through the sound system. "We built this firm on a foundation of excellence. In our world, success is never a coincidence. It is the result of breeding, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to legacy. Our family understands, better than most, the value of a superior bloodline. We do not simply manage wealth. We preserve a standard of greatness that separates the exceptional from the merely ordinary." The crowd murmured its polite agreement, glasses lifting in quiet approval. I kept my eyes locked on my water glass, silently praying he would move on and thank his employees instead. Instead, Richard turned his gaze directly toward our table. His eyes locked onto mine, and a cruel, calculated smile spread slowly across his face. "Of course," he continued, Maintaining a legacy like ours requires a certain level of magnanimity. His voice took on a mocking, theatrical edge. We must always remember to give back to those less fortunate than ourselves. My son Preston has always taken our family's philanthropic mission deeply to heart. In fact, his dedication to charity runs so profound that he brought it directly into our own home. A few uncertain chuckles rippled through the crowd, guests unsure of exactly where this toast was heading. Richard raised his glass higher, gesturing pointedly, unmistakably, in my direction. 10 years ago, Preston could have chosen a partner from any of the prominent families in this very room. Instead, he chose to elevate a woman from absolute zero, a woman who spends her days digging through the dirt of old, crumbling houses, pretending it's a real profession. He gave her a name, a lifestyle, and a seat at this table. It takes a truly generous man to overlook such a stark lack of pedigree and still try to polish a stone, hoping against hope it might one day shine like a diamond. So let us raise our glasses to Preston and to his relentless, unwavering commitment to charity. The words hung in the air, dripping with venom no one bothered to disguise. I stood frozen in place, my face burning with a humiliation so complete it felt like a physical weight crushing down on my chest. I scanned the ballroom desperately, hoping someone, anyone, would recognize how cruel and inappropriate this truly was. But I found no sympathy anywhere in that room. Instead, the entire ballroom erupted into laughter. 600 elite guests, the supposed cream of high society, were laughing openly at me. I looked toward Beatrice, and she was smirking without even trying to hide it, barely concealing her amusement behind a crystal goblet. Camille giggled loudly, leaning heavily into DeAndre, who simply shook his head and took another slow, deliberate sip of his drink, his expression utterly devoid of any empathy. My last remaining hope was Preston. I turned to my husband, the man who had promised 10 years ago to love and protect me for the rest of our lives. I waited for him to step forward, to take the microphone from his father, to defend his wife, and to demand some measure of respect. I waited for him to prove, once and for all, that a decade of marriage meant more to him than his father's toxic, conditional approval. But Preston did not look angry. He did not look defensive, or embarrassed, or ashamed. He looked first at his father, then at the laughing crowd, and he smiled. Preston raised his glass high into the air, turned toward Richard, and clinked it against his father's in total wholehearted agreement. In that sickening, gut-wrenching moment, I understood with total clarity that I was entirely alone in that room, and that my own husband had become my greatest enemy. The applause and laughter continued rolling and echoing against the vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. I stood perfectly still. Once, a moment like this might have brought me to tears. But tonight, the absolute betrayal glowing in Preston's eyes shifted something fundamental deep inside my chest. The warmth of 10 years of marriage evaporated instantly, leaving behind only a cold, hard clarity. I looked at my husband, smiling proudly beside his father, and felt, for the very first time, absolutely nothing for him. To my left, a small jazz band had set up a sleek silver microphone stand. I did not run. I did not cry. I walked forward with slow, deliberate steps toward that microphone, my navy blue gown brushing softly against the polished marble floor with every step. The guests watched me closely, clearly expecting a quiet, embarrassed exit. Beatrice nudged Camille, pointing a manicured finger in my direction, both women waiting eagerly for my complete and total humiliation to finally play out. I reached the silver stand and gripped the cold metal of the microphone. That coldness, oddly enough, grounded me completely. I tapped it twice. The sharp thud echoed across the sound system, instantly slicing through the symphony of elitist laughter still filling the room. 600 faces turned back toward me all at once. Richard frowned, visibly annoyed by the sudden interruption to his moment of triumph. Preston lowered his champagne flute slowly, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. I took a deep, steadying breath. My voice projected clear and unwavering across the massive ballroom. "Thank you, Richard, for that incredibly illuminating toast," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite and carefully measured. "It's true. My background is very different from yours. I spend my days evaluating old structures, identifying rot hidden deep within the foundations, and saving things that stand on the very verge of total collapse." I paused deliberately, letting the words settle heavily over the room. The crowd remained silent, clearly unsure of my intent. I looked directly at my father-in-law and watched his arrogant smile begin, ever so slightly, to falter. "And speaking of structures on the verge of collapse," I continued, "I think it's only fair to mention exactly how far my charity truly extends in this family. You see, my little renovation business, as you so kindly called it, happened to be quite busy last month. In fact, we were so busy that I was personally able to wire $200,000 directly into Preston's primary trading account." A collective gasp rippled instantly through the front tables. I did not break eye contact with Richard for even a second. "Yes," I said loudly, making absolutely certain everyone in that ballroom could hear me clearly. $200,000 of my hard-earned dirt-digging money, wired just in time to cover a massive margin call. It seems the so-called superior bloodline was roughly 48 hours away from defaulting on a highly leveraged commercial real estate position. So you are absolutely right, Richard. I do fix crumbling foundations. I simply saved yours from complete and total bankruptcy." The heavy silence that followed was absolute and truly terrifying in its weight. It was a suffocating quiet, one in which not a single human breath could be heard among all 600 elite guests. Then, slowly, the whispering began. It started as a low hiss, spreading rapidly and urgently from table to table. Investors leaned into one another, exchanging panicked, sidelong glances. Corporate titans who had entrusted Richard with their millions suddenly stared directly at him with intense suspicion and open, unmasked fear. Richard stood frozen at the podium. All the color drained instantly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His jaw hung slightly open, completely stripped of the arrogance he had worn so proudly only minutes before. Beatrice dropped her crystal goblet. It shattered against the marble floor, but she didn't even glance down at it. Her face twisted into an expression of absolute horror as the social standing she had worshipped for a lifetime began quietly disintegrating right before her eyes. Camille covered her mouth with both hands, her gaze darting frantically between me and her father. But it was DeAndre who truly, immediately understood the gravity of what I'd just said. The brilliant, ruthless corporate lawyer did not panic like the rest of them. He narrowed his dark eyes and studied me with a chilling, calculating intensity, his legal mind already racing to assess the full extent of the damage. He realized in that split second that the quiet, unassuming daughter-in-law he had always dismissed possessed intimate knowledge of their deepest, most closely guarded financial vulnerabilities. I was no longer merely an embarrassment to this family. I was now an active, immediate threat to their entire empire. I turned my gaze away from DeAndre and looked instead at my husband. Preston was shaking, visibly and uncontrollably. His carefully constructed image of power and superiority had been completely shattered in an instant. For a man who lived entirely for the validation and admiration of the upper class, being exposed as a financial failure, one saved no less by his working-class wife, was the ultimate emasculation imaginable. The very peers he had spent years desperately trying to impress were now looking at him with nothing but pity and open disgust. His face turned a violent shade of red. The veins along his neck bulged visibly against his expensive silk collar. He dropped his glass without ceremony and let out a primal roar of pure, unfiltered rage. "You shut your mouth!" he screamed, his voice cracking sharply with fury. Preston charged across the ballroom floor. Guests scrambled desperately out of his path, yanking their chairs back to avoid his blind, reckless rage. I stood my ground, still gripping the microphone, refusing to show even the slightest flicker of fear. He closed the distance between us within seconds. I assumed, foolishly, that he would simply grab the microphone from my hands or scream directly into my face. I never expected the violence that followed. Preston lunged forward, shifting his entire weight, and swung his right arm with everything he had. His open palm struck the side of my face with a sickening crack that echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. The force of the blow was staggering. A burst of blinding white light exploded across my vision, and the sharp, metallic taste of blood instantly flooded my mouth. The impact actually lifted my feet off the marble floor. I spun backward, entirely out of control, my balance completely gone. Directly behind me stood a massive 10-tier champagne tower, glowing softly under the ballroom's spotlights. I crashed heavily into the display. Hundreds of crystal glasses shattered in a spectacular, deafening explosion of glass and expensive vintage champagne. Sharp shards rained down all around me as I collapsed onto the soaking wet marble floor, entirely surrounded by the wreckage of their once perfect celebration. The sharp sting of broken crystal sliced clean through the thin fabric of my gown. Champagne soaked into my skin, mixing freely with the metallic taste of blood already pooling in my mouth. I lay there for one long, suspended fraction of a second, staring straight up at the vaulted ceiling far above me. The silence in the ballroom was absolute and complete. Not a single person stepped forward to help. 600 elite guests simply stood there and watched me bleed. I pushed myself slowly up onto my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp glass digging painfully into my palms. My ears rang violently from the force of the slap, but somehow my vision remained perfectly, unnervingly clear. I looked toward the front tables. Camille stood there, one hand covering her mouth, a sharp, cruel laugh escaping her lips despite her attempt to stifle it. She clearly found my physical humiliation genuinely entertaining. Beside her, DeAndre neither smiled nor flinched. The brilliant corporate lawyer simply raised his glass of bourbon once more, took a slow, deliberate sip, and watched me with absolute chilling detachment. He was already, quietly, calculating the legal fallout to come. I forced myself to stand. Champagne dripped steadily from my ruined dress, pooling in dark patches on the marble floor beneath me. I wiped the blood from my split lower lip with the back of my hand, unhurried. I did not rush. I bent down and picked the microphone up out of the wreckage, then looked Preston dead in the eye. He was breathing heavily, fists clenched tight at his sides, still visibly trying to project raw power, but his eyes betrayed nothing but sheer mounting panic. I dropped the microphone. It struck the marble with a deafening screech of feedback that seemed to hang in the air. Then I turned, and I walked away. I kept my head held high, forcing every single guest in that ballroom to step aside and clear a path for me as I passed. The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom swung shut behind me, cutting off, at last, the suffocating whispers that had filled the room only moments before. The grand corridor of the country club stood entirely deserted. I walked past ornate oil paintings and gilded mirrors, leaving behind a slow trail of wet footprints and shattered crystal in my wake. The physical pain in my cheek had already begun radiating outward across my entire face, but I refused, stubbornly, to acknowledge it. I pushed open the door to the grand restroom. The space beyond was pristine, gold fixtures gleaming softly against cool white marble counters. I walked straight to the vanity and gripped the edge of the sink with both hands, staring hard at my own reflection. A dark purple bruise was already blossoming across my left cheekbone. My lip was split and swelling rapidly by the second. My carefully styled hair hung in wet, matted strands against my neck. I looked, undeniably, like a victim. But staring at that bruised, battered face in the mirror, I did not feel like one. What I felt instead was a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. For 10 long years, I had faithfully played the role they assigned me. I had been the quiet, unassuming wife who smiled politely through every insult and swallowed every ounce of disrespect without complaint. I had hidden my true identity for a decade, desperate to prove that I could be loved for who I truly was, and not for what my family possessed. Tonight, Preston had proven, once and for all, that my quiet experiment in living a normal, ordinary life had been a complete and total failure. He did not love me. He loved the control he believed he held over me. I reached into the small hidden pocket sewn into my ruined gown and pulled out my phone. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks from the fall, but it still worked perfectly well. I opened my contacts and scrolled slowly past the decorators, the contractors, the historical preservation boards. I scrolled past Preston, past Beatrice, past Camille. I stopped at a number I hadn't dialed in nearly a decade, a number belonging to a man whose very name commanded fear and absolute respect throughout the highest echelons of global finance. My thumb hovered over the screen. Calling this number meant the end of my quiet, carefully constructed life. It meant unleashing a force capable of completely obliterating the fragile world Preston and his arrogant family had built for themselves. It meant returning, finally, to the very empire I had once walked away from. I looked at my bruised face one last time. Then I pressed the call button and raised the phone slowly to my ear. The line rang only once. It did not go to an assistant. It did not go to a secretary. A deep, commanding voice answered immediately. The voice of a man who controlled billions of dollars and countless lives with a single word. He said only one thing. Naomi. I closed my eyes. 10 years of distance vanished in a single instant. I did not cry. I did not explain the gala or the slap or the humiliation still burning across my face. I spoke only 3 words. Dad, please come. The line went dead. He did not ask a single question. He did not need any further details. Harrison Global operated with swift, devastating efficiency, and my father was the sole architect of that power. I lowered the phone and set it gently down on the marble counter. I turned on the gold faucet and splashed freezing cold water onto my face. The sharp sting of the cold against my split lip brought me back, sharply, to the immediate reality of the night. I grabbed a thick white towel and began drying my arms and neck carefully. The soft fabric snagged on a small piece of crystal still embedded in my skin. I pulled it free and tossed it into the sink without ceremony. I was no longer the charity case they had dragged to their anniversary gala. I was the rightful heir to an empire they could not even begin to comprehend. Suddenly, my cracked phone screen lit up. A sharp buzz echoed against the marble walls of the pristine bathroom. I picked up the device and looked at the notification waiting on the screen. It was a text message from Preston. I swiped it open and read the words he had typed in his blind, arrogant rage. "Don't bother coming back to my house. You're getting nothing. DeAndre is already drafting the papers." I read the cruel message twice, deliberately, making sure I memorized every bitter syllable. He genuinely believed he still held all the power. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my ruined pocket. The game was finally, irreversibly changing, and my husband had absolutely no idea what was coming for him next. I left the country club through the service exit, carefully avoiding the valet staff altogether. My ruined gown clung to my skin, and the cold night air bit sharply into the fresh bruise blooming across my cheek. I hailed a passing taxi, slid quietly into the back seat, and gave the driver the address of the marital home I had shared with Preston for the past decade. The house itself was a stunning piece of late 19th century architecture. I had personally spent 3 long years restoring its original mahogany trim and repairing its aging slate roof, board by board, tile by tile. The taxi pulled away, leaving me standing alone on the pristine brick driveway. I walked up the front steps and reached for the electronic keypad governing the heavy oak door. I punched in the 6-digit code we had always used. A harsh red light blinked back at me. Access denied. I tried again, pressing the numbers firmly and deliberately. The red light flashed a second time, followed by a sharp, mocking automated beep. DeAndre had moved faster than I had anticipated. The ruthless corporate lawyer had likely dispatched an emergency locksmith the very moment Preston sent that cruel text message. They wanted to lock me out completely, cut off entirely from my passport, my financial documents, and every personal belonging I owned. They thought they could leave me shivering alone on the porch, like some discarded stray. But they had conveniently forgotten exactly who had restored this house from the ground up. I turned away from the front door and walked quietly down the narrow side path, slipping past the manicured hedges and the tall iron gates. I made my way toward the rear of the estate, where the foundation met the gently sloping garden. The shadows ran deep back there, hiding the original stonework from view. During the foundation repairs years earlier, I had insisted on preserving an old coal chute window near the basement utility room. Preston had demanded it be sealed permanently with concrete, but I had convinced the contractors, quietly, to install a reinforced latch instead, one that could still be bypassed, if you knew the exact pressure point to strike. I knelt down in the damp soil, ruining what remained of my silk gown even further. I reached beneath the cast iron grate, feeling carefully for the hidden mechanism. My fingers finally found the cold steel lever. I pressed upward with my thumb and applied my full weight against the frame. The old hinges groaned in protest but gave way at last. The small window swung inward, revealing the pitch-black basement beyond. I slipped quietly through the narrow opening, dropping softly onto the concrete floor below. The darkness enveloped me completely, but I didn't need any light. I navigated the basement entirely by memory, weaving past the wine cellar and the climate control units until I reached the main staircase. I climbed the wooden steps in total silence, my bare feet making no sound at all against the polished oak floors above. The house stood completely empty around me, but somehow it felt entirely alien now, foreign in a way it never had before. I marched straight up the grand staircase toward the master bedroom. I only needed my passport, my private hard drive, and a handful of essential items before my father arrived. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the master suite and stepped quietly inside. Soft moonlight filtered gently through the sheer curtains, illuminating a scene of absolute calculated disrespect. Lined up against the far wall were 6 heavy-duty black trash bags, bulging and haphazardly tied shut. Some of my clothes spilled carelessly out of the nearest bag, my expensive silk blouses, my tailored work trousers, my favorite cashmere sweaters, all stuffed unceremoniously into the garbage like worthless refuse. Preston had not packed my things with any care at all. He had simply thrown them away. He wanted to erase my presence from this house as quickly and as brutally as possible. I walked over to the bags, feeling a surge of cold, clinical anger rather than any real sorrow. I knelt down to retrieve a practical pair of jeans and a dark turtleneck sweater, anything to get out of this torn, bloody gown at last. As I pulled the sweater free from the plastic bag, my eyes drifted toward our king-sized bed. The duvet had been pulled back, revealing the expensive white sheets beneath. I stepped closer and noticed a small splash of vibrant color resting near the pillows. It was a piece of crimson lace lingerie. Small, delicate, and utterly foreign to me. I stared at the garment lying casually on the very bed where I had slept for the past 10 years of my life. The full reality of the situation locked coldly into place. Preston was not merely a financial failure and an abusive husband. He had been carrying on an affair right here, inside our own home. He had brought another woman into the space I had painstakingly restored with my own 2 hands. He had let her sleep in our bed while I worked tirelessly, out in the world, to save his arrogant family from total financial ruin. I picked up the crimson lace between my thumb and forefinger. It felt cheap, flimsy, almost pathetic. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was staggering, even after everything else that had happened that night. He wanted me out tonight not simply to punish me for humiliating his father, but because he had every intention of bringing this woman back into our home. I dropped the lingerie back onto the pillows without another thought. I calmly pulled off my ruined gown, letting the torn silk pool quietly around my ankles. I pulled on my jeans and the dark cashmere sweater, relishing the simple warmth of dry clothing at last. I walked to my private safe, hidden behind a false panel deep inside the walk-in closet. I entered the biometric code and retrieved my passport along with the encrypted hard drive containing all of my independent business assets. I zipped my few remaining belongings into a single leather duffel bag and slung the strap over my shoulder, finally ready to walk out of this toxic prison for good. But before I could take even a single step toward the hallway, a sharp mechanical sound echoed up from the ground floor below. The electronic deadbolt on the front door whirred and clicked, heavy brass tumblers releasing from the locking mechanism. The heavy oak door swung open, striking the entryway wall with a loud, careless thud. I froze instantly, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the master closet. Footsteps echoed sharply against the marble foyer, heavy, deliberate steps belonging to 2 men walking with total, unquestioned ownership of the space. I heard Preston laughing, a cruel and arrogant sound that carried easily up the stairs. He was not alone. He had brought his legal mastermind with him. DeAndre's voice carried clearly up the grand staircase, calm and precise. The lawyer was outlining, in exacting detail, the exact legal maneuvers he intended to execute by morning, detailing exactly how they planned to freeze my bank accounts and ensure I left the marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. Their footsteps moved past the kitchen and began climbing the stairs. They were heading directly toward the master bedroom, entirely unaware that the very woman they intended to destroy was standing quietly in the dark, waiting patiently for them to arrive. I stood perfectly still in the darkness of the master closet, gripping the heavy strap of my leather duffel bag with both hands. The footsteps crossed the threshold of the bedroom. The harsh glare of the overhead lights flickered on instantly, banishing the soft moonlight that had filled the room only moments before. Preston let out a sharp, startled breath. He knew immediately, instinctively, that I had somehow bypassed his security measures. I did not wait for him to search the room. I stepped calmly out of the shadows and walked into the center of the master suite. My dark cashmere sweater and jeans stood in stark contrast to the glittering spectacle of the gala I had just escaped only an hour before. Preston glared at me, his jaw clenched tight with fury. The red mark where he had struck my face was now mirrored perfectly by the dark purple bruise blooming steadily across my own cheekbone. "You always were a stubborn problem," Preston sneered, stepping aside to let his legal mastermind enter the room ahead of him. DeAndre walked in with the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who owned the world outright. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his expression completely devoid of any trace of human empathy. He carried a thick, leather-bound folder in his right hand. He did not offer a single word of greeting. He simply walked over to the king-sized bed and dropped the heavy stack of legal documents onto the pristine white sheets. The heavy folder landed right beside the cheap crimson lace lingerie Preston had so carelessly left out for his mistress. DeAndre adjusted his cufflinks and looked at me with cold, unblinking calculation. "We're going to make this very simple, Naomi," DeAndre began, his deep voice echoing through the large room. "You humiliated Richard tonight. You threatened the stability of the entire family fund. Therefore, your tenure in this family is officially, permanently terminated. The documents on that bed represent a clean break divorce settlement. At least, that's how it's titled. In reality, it's a highly restrictive post-nuptial agreement, drafted retroactively to protect Preston from what we've decided to call your erratic behavior." I looked at the thick stack of papers, then back at the ruthless corporate lawyer standing before me. I did not shout, and I did not cry. I simply asked him, calmly, to explain exactly how he intended to enforce a retroactive agreement drafted after the fact. DeAndre smiled. It was a chilling, predatory expression, one that clearly relished the opportunity to dismantle an opponent piece by piece. He stepped closer to the bed, tapping the leather folder lightly with a manicured finger. "You see, Naomi, you made a critical error the moment you deposited your earnings into our joint marital accounts," DeAndre explained, deploying his sharpest legal jargon with obvious relish. "Over the past 18 months, I have been acting as Preston's fiduciary counsel. I established a series of shell corporations under the convenient guise of commercial real estate investments. Every dollar you earned from your historic preservation business, every single wire transfer you ever made, was systematically routed straight into those holding companies. We then executed a series of strategic internal loans that intentionally defaulted on paper. The liquidity never actually vanished. It was simply legally restructured and quietly transferred into an irrevocable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands." My mind raced as I processed the sheer magnitude of their financial betrayal. They hadn't merely planned to divorce me. They had been actively, methodically stealing from me for well over a year. I stared directly at DeAndre, forcing him to reveal the rest of his malicious strategy in full. "And who exactly is the beneficiary of this offshore trust?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level and calm. "Camille," DeAndre replied, without a single flicker of remorse crossing his face. "My wife is the sole beneficiary of the trust. Your life savings, your business profits, and every asset you brought into this marriage now legally belong to her. The accounts are entirely boxed out, fully shielded by international privacy laws. You have absolutely zero legal claim to your own money. You are completely and utterly bankrupt, Naomi." Preston barked out a cruel, arrogant laugh. He walked over to the bed and picked up the crimson lingerie, tossing it carelessly onto the floor without a second glance. "You actually thought you could walk into our gala and threaten my father?" Preston mocked, his eyes flashing with vindictive delight. "You thought wiring $200,000 made you powerful? You're nothing but a glorified construction worker. We took your money because you were too stupid to even notice. Now you have no family left to protect you, no savings to hire a lawyer, and absolutely no place to sleep tonight." I tightened my grip on the duffel bag, quietly analyzing their entire strategy from every angle. They were relying entirely on shock and financial devastation to force my full compliance. They believed I was nothing more than an isolated working-class woman who would crumble instantly under the weight of their elite legal maneuvering. DeAndre reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a sleek silver pen. He clicked it once. The sharp metallic sound broke the heavy tension hanging over the room. He held the pen out toward me, offering it almost like a weapon. "You have two choices," DeAndre said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, authoritative timbre. You can take this pen and sign the agreement on the final page. If you sign, you agree to waive all rights to spousal support and relinquish any claim whatsoever to the stolen funds. In exchange, Preston is graciously offering you a $5,000 relocation fee, more than enough to rent a cheap apartment somewhere and start your pathetic little life over. You take the money, and you walk out that door tonight. And my second choice? I asked, refusing to break eye contact with him for even a moment. DeAndre stepped forward, his tall frame looming directly over me. He shoved the silver pen even closer toward my bruised face. If you refuse to sign today, I will personally bury you in endless litigation, ensuring every single dollar you ever make again is garnished to cover our legal fees. Sign this, take the $5,000, and walk away quietly. Or I will bury you in so much litigation that you'll be paying legal fees well into your 70s. I did not reach for the silver pen. I looked at DeAndre, and then shifted my gaze slowly toward the thick leather-bound folder resting on my ruined bed. I reached out and picked up the heavy stack of documents. The paper felt thick, expensive, deliberately intimidating in its weight. I flipped open the cover and began reading through the clauses DeAndre had so meticulously, so carefully drafted. The level of malice embedded in the legal jargon was, in its own way, genuinely impressive. They had included sweeping financial waivers. DeAndre had written in a permanent gag order, one designed to prevent me from ever speaking publicly about the family or their business practices again. There was a strict non-compete clause, clearly engineered to completely destroy my historic preservation career by barring me from working within a 500-mile radius of the city. The final page even included a pre-drafted admission of fault, stating outright that I had personally caused the breakdown of the marriage due to my own unstable, erratic behavior. They wanted to strip me of my money, my career, my voice, and ultimately my sanity, all in one carefully worded document. I read through the final lines, noting the specific blank space left waiting for my signature. Preston watched me with a triumphant smirk, clearly believing the sheer weight of the legal threats had finally, completely crushed my spirit. DeAndre stood perfectly still, patiently waiting for me to accept my total defeat. They both fully expected me to break down in tears, to beg for a larger settlement, or simply to sign my life away out of sheer, overwhelming terror. Instead, I closed the folder. I looked DeAndre directly in the eyes. I gripped the thick stack of premium legal paper firmly with both hands. I braced my wrists, twisted my grip, and applied every ounce of my strength. The sound of thick paper tearing ripped violently through the silence of the master bedroom. I tore the entire post-nuptial agreement perfectly in half. I let the severed pieces of their meticulous legal trap fall quietly from my hands, scattering across the floor at their feet. The heavy halves of the contract landed with a dull, satisfying thud directly onto the toes of DeAndre's expensive Italian leather shoes. I turned my back on the ruthless lawyer without a second glance and walked toward the dark corner of the room where I had left my things. I reached down, picked up the heavy strap of my leather duffel bag, and slung it securely over my shoulder once more. I stood tall, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of my encrypted hard drive and my passport pressing against my side. I had everything I truly needed to destroy them, and none of it was written on that torn piece of paper. Preston stared down at the shredded documents scattered across the floor, and then erupted into a cruel, mocking laugh that filled the room. "You're completely delusional, Naomi," he sneered, taking a slow step toward me. "Do you honestly think tearing up a piece of paper changes your reality? You have absolutely nothing. You have no family to run to. You have no trust fund to fall back on. You have no powerful daddy to call for some dramatic rescue. You're just a stray dog we brought in from the cold, and now you're going right back out into it." Preston kept closing the distance between us, his voice rising steadily in both volume and viciousness. I gave you everything you have. I elevated you from nothing. And now you're going straight back to the gutter you crawled out of. Where exactly do you think you're going to go tonight? Your bank accounts are frozen solid. Your credit cards will decline the instant you try to swipe them. You can't afford a hotel room. You can't even afford a cab ride across the city. You'll be sleeping on wet concrete like a homeless beggar by midnight, and it will be entirely your own fault. DeAndre crossed his arms, looking at me with undisguised disdain. You made a very poor calculation tonight, Naomi, he said coldly. I'll file the original digital copies first thing tomorrow morning. You'll be served with a lawsuit so massive it will guarantee you never work in this state again. You really should have taken the $5,000 while you still had the chance. I did not offer a single word in response. I felt no need to defend myself to men who, financially speaking, were already dead and simply didn't know it yet. I simply adjusted the strap of my duffel bag and started walking calmly toward the bedroom door. Preston blocked my path immediately, his face twisted with arrogant, boiling rage. He grabbed my upper arm roughly, his fingers digging painfully into my skin, and shoved me forcefully toward the hallway. "Get out of my house!" Preston shouted, pushing me hard toward the grand staircase. "Get out before I have you arrested for trespassing on my own property." I caught my balance just in time and descended the stairs, my bare feet striking the cold, polished wood with every step. Preston followed closely behind me the entire way, shoving me again the moment I reached the grand foyer below. DeAndre came down the stairs at a far slower, more deliberate pace, watching my forced eviction unfold with something like clinical satisfaction. Preston marched straight to the heavy oak front door and yanked it open with unnecessary force. A violent storm had rolled in from the coast while I'd been inside, and the wind howled savagely through the open doorway, driving sheets of freezing rain directly onto the marble floor of the foyer. Lightning flashed somewhere in the distance, briefly illuminating the manicured lawns and the dark brick driveway beyond. The temperature outside had plummeted sharply in just the last hour. Preston shoved me one final time, pushing me hard through the open doorway and out into the night. I stumbled onto the wet stone porch, barely managing to keep my footing on the slick surface. The freezing rain instantly soaked through my dark cashmere sweater and jeans. I turned around slowly to face my husband. Preston stood safely in the warm, dry foyer, a cruel, satisfied smile plastered across his face. "Welcome back to the real world," Preston mocked, raising his voice to be heard over the roaring wind. "Have a nice life in the gutter, Naomi." He grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the oak door shut with a bang that echoed even over the storm. The loud, final crack of the deadbolt sliding into place followed a beat behind the thunder. I was officially, completely locked out in the freezing cold. I walked slowly down the stone steps and stepped out onto the flooded brick driveway. The freezing rain beat relentlessly down on my shoulders, matting my hair against my bruised, throbbing cheek. The wind whipped past me in violent gusts, chilling me straight to the bone. I stood completely alone at the dark curb of the massive estate, gripping my leather duffel bag with both hands. The street stretched out entirely empty in both directions. The upscale neighborhood had gone silent except for the violent hiss of pouring rain and the distant rolling rumble of thunder. Somewhere behind me, inside the warm house, Preston and DeAndre were already pouring themselves bourbon, celebrating what they believed was my complete and total destruction. They were certain I was utterly defeated. I stared down the long, dark street ahead of me, refusing to let myself shiver. Suddenly, the pitch-black darkness of the wealthy neighborhood was pierced by a blinding set of LED headlights. The intense white beams sliced through the driving rain, sweeping steadily across the wet pavement as they approached. It was not just one vehicle. A massive convoy of 3 identical black Cadillac Escalades emerged out of the storm, one after another. The heavy luxury SUVs moved in perfect, almost menacing synchronization. The convoy glided smoothly up the street, their tires hissing softly against the flooded asphalt beneath them. All three massive vehicles pulled up to the curb in formation and came to a seamless, simultaneous halt directly in front of me. The heavy engines idled with a low, powerful hum that vibrated faintly through the flooded pavement and up into my bare feet. Rain lashed hard against the dark-tinted windows, but the convoy itself remained perfectly, eerily still. The synchronized arrival of these vehicles was clearly no coincidence. It was a calculated display of absolute precision and terrifying, almost limitless resources. I stood there shivering in my soaked cashmere sweater, still clutching my leather duffel bag, as the blinding white headlights cut steadily through the torrential downpour around me. Behind me, the heavy oak front door of the estate swung open once again. Preston and DeAndre stepped out onto the sheltered stone porch, drawn outside by the sudden, unexpected illumination flooding the street. They had clearly expected to find me crawling away into the darkness somewhere, or perhaps begging on my knees in the rain. Instead, they found me standing calmly, illuminated by a fleet of vehicles that, combined, likely cost more than their entire annual salaries put together. I could hear Preston scoffing loudly over the roaring wind, apparently assuming this was some kind of mistake, or perhaps a lost motorcade simply making a wrong turn in his exclusive neighborhood. He leaned casually against the brick pillar of the porch, crossing his arms with arrogant amusement. DeAndre stood beside him, his sharp legal mind clearly already working to process this highly unusual disruption to the evening. The rear door of the lead Escalade swung open. A man in a pristine dark suit stepped out into the freezing rain without so much as flinching against the storm. He opened a massive black umbrella in one fluid motion, holding it steady with something like military discipline, and turned to extend his free hand toward the dark, shadowed interior of the vehicle. Then, my father stepped out. Harrison moved with the kind of effortless, unshakable authority that simply cannot be bought or faked, no matter how much money one throws at the attempt. He wore a charcoal overcoat layered neatly over a bespoke midnight blue suit. He did not rush, and he did not glance around the neighborhood with the desperate curiosity of a man trying to gauge his own social standing. He already owned the world in every way that mattered, and his very posture seemed to demand immediate, unspoken submission from everything around him. He walked toward me, his leather shoes stepping directly into the freezing puddles without a single moment of hesitation or concern. The security guard kept the umbrella perfectly centered above his head the entire time, shielding him completely from the violent storm. I had not seen my father in nearly a decade. I had walked away from his towering empire because I wanted, more than anything, to prove that I could build a life entirely on my own merits. I wanted to be loved for my hard work and my character, not for the billions of dollars quietly attached to my last name. Looking at him now, standing there in the freezing rain, I understood all at once just how foolish my 10-year experiment had truly been. Harrison stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The icy rain was instantly blocked by the wide, sheltering canopy of the black umbrella above us both. My father did not look at the massive house looming behind me. He did not look at the expensive cars parked in Preston's driveway. He looked only at me. His sharp, dark eyes scanned slowly over my soaked clothes, my visibly shivering frame, and my bare feet standing on the freezing concrete. Then his gaze locked, finally, onto the left side of my face. He saw the dark purple bruise blooming across my cheekbone. He saw my split, swollen lip. The temperature beneath that umbrella seemed to drop another 20 degrees in an instant. I watched the muscles along my father's jaw clench tight. A terrifying, silent fury radiated outward from him so intensely that the security guard standing beside him visibly stiffened at the change. Harrison was a man who dismantled entire global corporations before breakfast without breaking a sweat. Seeing his only daughter physically assaulted pushed him, for the first time in years, to the absolute edge of his legendary self-restraint. But he did not yell. He did not charge up onto the porch. He simply unbuttoned his heavy cashmere overcoat and slipped it calmly off his own shoulders. He stepped forward and wrapped the thick, warm fabric snugly around my shivering shoulders. The coat smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne, providing an instant, welcome shield against the biting cold. He pulled the lapels tight across my chest, securing my leather duffel bag beneath the heavy wool. He lifted his hand and gently brushed a wet strand of hair away from my uninjured cheek. "Get in, sweetheart," Harrison said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that carried absolute, unquestionable finality. "Their game is over." On the stone porch, Preston let out a loud, mocking laugh, clearly trying to reassert his dominance over a situation he still did not fundamentally understand. He stepped forward to the edge of the stairs, cupping his hands around his mouth to shout over the wind. "Who exactly is this, Naomi?" he yelled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you call some fancy taxi service to come rescue you from the gutter? You're going to need a lot more than a nice ride to save you from what we're filing tomorrow morning." Harrison finally shifted his gaze. He looked past me, staring directly at the man who had just struck his daughter across the face. My father did not shout back. He did not offer a single word of rebuttal or threat. He simply looked at Preston with the same absolute cold disgust one might reserve for a cockroach scurrying across a kitchen floor. The sheer weight of that silent stare was devastating all on its own. Preston actually took a small physical step backward, his arrogant smile faltering visibly under the crushing intimidation of a true apex predator finally standing before him. DeAndre stopped leaning against the pillar entirely, his posture going rigid as he belatedly recognized the unspoken power radiating up from the street below. My father placed a firm, steady hand on my back and guided me gently toward the open door of the waiting Escalade. I climbed carefully into the warm leather interior, pulling my legs inside after me. Harrison slid in right beside me, taking the seat directly next to mine. The security guard closed the heavy armored door behind us, shutting out the howling wind and the freezing rain entirely and completely. The cabin fell silent, incredibly warm, and completely secure. Without a single spoken command, the convoy began to move. All three massive vehicles accelerated smoothly together, gliding away from the curb in perfect, practiced unison. I looked out through the tinted window as we pulled away, watching Preston and DeAndre standing on the porch of the house I had spent an entire decade painstakingly restoring. They shrank rapidly into the distance, looking small and entirely insignificant against the dark, storm-battered backdrop of the estate behind them. They believed, in that moment, that they had won. They believed they had stripped me of everything that mattered. Back on the wet stone porch, Preston scoffed loudly, shaking his head as the taillights finally disappeared around the corner. "She's pathetic," Preston muttered, turning back toward the heavy oak door. "She probably begged some high-end car service to let her ride on credit. Doesn't matter either way. The post-nuptial agreement still stands. She'll be entirely bankrupt by morning. Come on, let's go finish that bourbon." DeAndre did not respond right away. The brilliant corporate lawyer stood frozen in place, staring out at the now empty street. Something about the sheer precision of that convoy unsettled his deeply analytical mind more than he wanted to admit. He reached into his tailored suit jacket as his phone suddenly began to vibrate violently against his palm. It was not a standard text message notification. It was the high-pitched emergency alert tone tied exclusively to his secure banking application. DeAndre swiped the screen open, his dark eyes scanning the urgent notification rapidly. The blood drained instantly from his face, leaving his expression slack with sudden, absolute terror. Preston paused at the door, glancing back at his brother-in-law with visible irritation. "What is it?" he asked, annoyed by the delay. DeAndre swallowed hard, his thumb hovering uncertainly over the glaring red text filling his screen. "A massive withdrawal attempt on our firm's primary credit line was just initiated," DeAndre whispered, his voice cracking audibly with panic. "And it was instantly blocked by an unknown corporate entity. Our entire operating liquidity has just been seized, Preston. All of it. The heavy armored doors of the Escalade insulated us entirely from both the violent storm outside and the financial panic I already knew was erupting back on my former front porch." My father did not speak during the drive. He simply stared straight ahead, his quiet presence acting as a silent fortress against the chaos of the night behind us. I pulled his cashmere overcoat tighter around my shivering frame and gripped my leather duffel bag a little more firmly. We drove through the slick, flooded streets of the city, gradually leaving the affluent suburbs behind and entering the towering concrete canyons of the financial district. The convoy descended seamlessly into a highly secured underground parking facility. Heavy steel gates rolled shut behind us, sealing out the rest of the world completely. A private elevator whisked us upward, ascending 60 floors without producing a single sound. The polished steel doors finally parted to reveal my father's $50 million penthouse. It was an absolute masterpiece of modern architecture, spanning the entire top floor of the skyscraper. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the storm-battered city stretching out below. The interior was a careful study in calculated luxury, featuring dark slate floors, rare obsidian accents, and austere, minimalist furniture that projected nothing but absolute, quiet power. A small team of staff was already waiting for us, having been alerted the very moment my father's motorcade picked me up off the street. A quiet, efficient woman guided me gently into a massive guest suite. She took my soaked, ruined clothes and handed me a plush robe, followed by a perfectly tailored pair of dark trousers and a heavy silk blouse. The dry garments felt like armor against my chilled, aching skin. When I emerged back into the main living area, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea was already waiting for me on a low glass table. Beside the table stood a man carrying a medical bag. My father never left anything to chance, and he had, without a word from me, already summoned his personal concierge physician. The doctor worked in near total silence. He carefully examined my jaw, checking for any hidden fractures, before applying a specialized cooling gel to the dark purple bruise still blooming across my cheekbone. The stinging pain began to recede almost immediately, replaced instead by a dull, far more manageable ache. The doctor packed up his bag, gave my father a sharp, confirming nod to indicate I was structurally sound, and quietly exited the penthouse without another word. I stood by the massive windows, looking out at the lightning striking somewhere among the distant skyscrapers. I held the warm teacup in both hands, letting its heat slowly seep back into my bones. Harrison walked up behind me, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. He did not look at the storm outside. He looked instead at my reflection in the glass. "10 years, Naomi," he said, his deep voice cutting cleanly through the quiet hum of the penthouse's climate control system. 10 years you spent playing house with parasites. You rejected your seat on the board. You rejected your security detail. You rejected your own name. I turned to face him fully, feeling the familiar weight of our old arguments rising back to the surface between us. "I wanted to build something real, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice steady and even. I wanted to know what it felt like to create a legacy with my own 2 hands, without the shadow of Harrison Global looming over every single achievement. I wanted to find a man who loved me for my mind and my character, not because marrying me meant instant access to $1 billion trust fund. My father took a slow, measured sip of his scotch, his dark eyes never once leaving mine. And did you find that genuine love, Naomi? Did your little experiment in playing an ordinary working-class citizen yield the results you were hoping for? The words stung precisely because they were absolutely true. My 10-year marriage had been, in the end, a complete fabrication. Preston had never loved my character. He had simply tolerated me because I was useful to him. He had enjoyed playing the role of wealthy benefactor to a woman he privately believed was beneath him socially. And the moment my usefulness shifted, the moment I dared to expose his financial incompetence in front of his elite peers, his affection transformed instantly into physical violence and calculated legal theft. He had stripped me of the modest savings I had built by digging quite literally through the dirt of old houses. I looked down at the dark slate floor beneath my feet. No, I admitted quietly. I was wrong. They never wanted a partner. They wanted a prop. And the moment I stopped being a convenient one, they locked me out in the freezing rain and tried to steal everything I had ever earned. Harrison set his crystal tumbler down on the glass table with a sharp, decisive clack. He walked over and stood directly in front of me, placing both hands squarely on my shoulders. His gaze was intense, burning with the kind of ruthless protectiveness that had built entire empires from nothing. "You are a Harrison," he stated firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We do not tolerate disrespect, and we absolutely do not allow thieves to walk away with what belongs to us. You wanted to prove you could survive in the real world. Well, you survived. But survival is for the weak, Naomi. We do not simply survive. We conquer." He stepped back and picked up a sleek silver iPad resting on his desk nearby. He walked back over and held the device out toward me. "You tried it your way," my father said, his tone shifting abruptly from parental concern into something closer to pure corporate warfare. "Now we do it mine." I took the tablet from his hands. The screen was already illuminated with a live, high-level financial dashboard. It was not some public stock ticker anyone could access. It was a proprietary back-channel data feed, quietly assessing the internal liquidity of Richard's wealth management fund in real time. The charts on screen were flooded with red lines from top to bottom. I scrolled past the initial summaries, absorbing the raw data as quickly as I could. DeAndre and Preston had been desperately shuffling money through a web of shell corporations, clearly trying to hide their increasingly toxic assets from view. The $200,000 I had wired them was barely a single drop in an endless ocean of mounting debt. They were dangerously over-leveraged on a commercial real estate project, and their margin calls were multiplying by the hour, growing worse with every passing minute. The fund was actively hemorrhaging money at a rate that was, by any measure, entirely unsustainable. My father watched my reaction carefully the entire time. He knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't simply looking for some crude act of vengeance. I did not want Preston beaten in a back alley somewhere, and I certainly did not want my father to just throw money at the problem until it quietly disappeared. I wanted them dismantled, piece by piece. I wanted the arrogant structure they had built their entire identities upon taken apart brick by brick, until nothing remained but the plain, undeniable truth of their own incompetence. "We can crush them by morning," Harrison said, his voice steady and clinical. "One phone call to the regulatory boards and they're finished. Their firm gets shuttered immediately, and DeAndre will be facing disbarment before he even finishes his morning coffee." I shook my head slowly, my eyes still locked on the red lines bleeding steadily across the iPad screen. "No," I replied softly. "If you destroy them entirely from the outside, they'll simply spin a narrative claiming they were the victims of some hostile corporate takeover. They'll play the martyrs beautifully. They need to be the architects of their own destruction instead. I want them to look at the paperwork one day and realize, all on their own, that they built their own guillotine with their own hands. Harrison smiled, a terrifying, proud expression that perfectly mirrored my own cold calculation. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen, setting it down beside a leather-bound contract already waiting on his desk. "Then it's time you stopped playing in the dirt and finally took your proper place," he said. "The position of Executive Vice President of Acquisitions has sat empty for 3 years now. I've been holding it for you the entire time. Sign the contract, Naomi. Become the apex predator you were always born to be." I did not hesitate for even a second. I picked up the silver pen. It felt significantly heavier and far more solid than the cheap plastic one DeAndre had tried to force into my hand only hours earlier. I signed my full legal name, Naomi Harrison, securing my position as the second most powerful executive at Harrison Global. "Good," my father said, taking the signed contract and locking it away in a secure drawer of his desk. "Now show me exactly how you plan to execute this family." I pulled up the detailed portfolio of Richard's wealth management fund on the iPad screen. I bypassed the standard surface-level metrics entirely and dug directly into their hard assets instead. Preston and DeAndre had been remarkably sloppy in their attempts to mask their true leverage. I highlighted a specific commercial real estate development located in the city's booming tech corridor. It was a massive, ambitious, multi-use complex, projected to house luxury retail spaces alongside high-end corporate offices. "Look at this project," I said, pointing to the staggering numbers attached to the development. 6 months ago, Preston brought this exact proposal to the dinner table, bragging endlessly about how it would cement the family's legacy for generations. I reviewed the architectural plans myself, along with the structural assessments. I specifically warned him at the time that the foundation of the primary building was seriously compromised by a subterranean water table issue. I told him then that the remediation cost alone would bankrupt the entire project before they even poured the first floor of concrete. Harrison leaned in, examining the data closely. "And he ignored your assessment entirely?" "Completely," I confirmed, my voice hardening at the memory. "He told me I was just a glorified contractor who didn't understand high-level commercial financing. He said his engineers had assured him the water issue was nothing more than a minor inconvenience." I tapped the screen, bringing up the most current construction reports available. It was not a minor inconvenience. They're currently $60 million over budget, just trying to keep the foundation from sinking further into the mud. They leveraged the entire family fund against this single development. When the margin calls hit last month, they started quietly pulling liquidity straight out of their own clients' accounts just to cover the mounting construction delays. "That's exactly why they stole my money, Dad. They're bleeding cash trying to plug a hole in a ship that's already sinking." My father's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. They violated their fiduciary duties simply to cover their own gross incompetence. It's a classic amateur mistake. "But how exactly does that let you dismantle them completely?" I smiled, swiping the screen to reveal the full financing structure behind the failing development. "Because they're out of time, Dad. The primary construction loan comes due for a massive balloon payment in exactly 5 days. If they default, the bank seizes the entire development, and the whole wealth management fund collapses under the cross-collateralization clauses DeAndre so arrogantly drafted himself." I looked up from the screen, meeting my father's intense gaze directly. "They're desperate. They need a massive infusion of capital immediately to avoid total bankruptcy. Right now, they're actively seeking a private equity bailout of $150 million just to cover that balloon payment and keep the whole project afloat a little longer." Harrison crossed his arms, leaning back easily against his heavy mahogany desk. "And who, exactly, are they courting for this desperate bailout of theirs?" I turned the iPad around so my father could see the active communication logs, already quietly intercepted by his own corporate intelligence team. Richard and Preston had been sending increasingly frantic emails and meeting requests to a single private equity titan. They believed wrongly that this titan represented their only real hope for survival. They were practically begging for an audience, offering absurdly favorable terms just to secure the desperately needed cash. "They're courting us," I said, the full reality of the situation aligning perfectly in my mind. Richard and Preston are currently begging Harrison Global for a $150 million lifeline. They have absolutely no idea that the woman they just locked out in the freezing rain is the executive vice president of the very company they're relying on to save their lives. The morning after my father's intervention, the full reality of my new position settled firmly over me. I was no longer the unassuming daughter-in-law desperately trying to fit into a world that had always despised me. I was Naomi Harrison, Executive Vice President of Acquisitions, and I now had the full, considerable weight of a global empire at my personal disposal. While I spent that morning carefully reviewing the intricate financial web DeAndre and Preston had woven together to cover their own incompetence, my former family was busy constructing a very different narrative entirely. Still oblivious to the true identity of the woman they had thrown out into the rain, Beatrice and Camille launched a coordinated, vicious smear campaign across their elite social circles almost immediately. My phone, which I had deliberately kept active specifically to monitor their behavior, began buzzing steadily with forwarded messages and screenshots sent by former acquaintances. Beatrice, ever the calculating socialite, wasted absolutely no time weaponizing the country club's gossip network in her favor. At a charity luncheon she hosted that very same morning, she played the part of the devastated, betrayed mother-in-law to absolute perfection. According to the accounts later relayed to me, Beatrice stood before her assembled peers, dabbing delicately at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, and wove an elaborate tale of profound deception. She claimed I had been systematically embezzling funds from Preston's personal accounts for years, quietly hiding the money away in offshore accounts the entire time. The story she spun painted me as a manipulative gold digger who had merely feigned a simple working-class background, all so I could slowly bleed her poor son dry. Camille, eager to participate fully in my public destruction, added her own venomous details to the growing narrative. She gleefully told anyone who would listen that the real reason I had disappeared so quickly after the gala was because I had a secret benefactor waiting patiently in the wings. She described, in vivid detail, the fleet of black Escalades that had arrived to collect me, deliberately twisting the arrival of my father's security detail into some sordid, scandalous affair. Camille claimed I had run off with a wealthy older sugar daddy, abandoning my marriage the very moment my supposed embezzlement had been discovered. The sheer audacity of their lies was genuinely breathtaking, but within the tight echo chamber of their privileged little world, the story took root almost immediately. They were counting entirely on my silence, assuming I was far too impoverished and humiliated to defend myself against their combined social influence. The malicious rumors, as vicious as they were, made up merely the social component of their attack. Preston, furious and increasingly desperate to reclaim the power he felt slipping steadily through his fingers, decided to dismantle the one thing he still believed I possessed: my career. My historic preservation business had been built on a full decade of meticulous work, specialized knowledge, and carefully cultivated relationships with key preservation boards across the entire state. Preston, leveraging both his position at the Wealth Management Fund and the considerable weight of his father's name, began calling it in contract for a highly publicized downtown revitalization project had been abruptly terminated, citing vague, unforeseen administrative restructuring. Less than an hour later, 2 more emails arrived from separate municipal preservation boards, indefinitely suspending my involvement in several upcoming heritage site evaluations. Preston had successfully blacklisted me from the primary sources of my own professional income. He had orchestrated a coordinated strike, apparently determined to ensure that even if I somehow tried to rebuild my life from scratch, I would find every single door firmly shut in my face. The final insult arrived, fittingly, via text message. My phone chimed, displaying a new notification from Preston. I opened it to find a screenshot of an email from one of the board chairmen, confirming the termination of my contract in cold, bureaucratic language. Beneath the image, Preston had typed a single, gloating sentence. "Told you that you were going back to the gutter. You're finished in this city." He was clearly reveling in his perceived victory, fully confident that he had neutralized the threat I posed and comfortably reasserted his absolute dominance over my life once and for all. I stared at the message, calmly analyzing the pathetic arrogance woven through every word of it. Preston genuinely believed he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, strategically removing my pieces from the board one at a time. He had no idea that while he busied himself manipulating a handful of local preservation boards, I was already operating on a scale he could not even begin to comprehend. I did not feel the crushing despair he had so clearly intended to inflict. Instead, his petty vindictiveness only solidified my resolve, sharpening my focus on the financial dismantling I had already begun to plan in careful detail. I did not reply to his text. I did not offer him the small satisfaction of knowing he had provoked any reaction from me at all. In this particular instance, silence was the most terrifying response I could possibly give him. I set my phone face down on the heavy mahogany desk in my new office at Harrison Global. I turned my full attention back to the sleek silver iPad, still displaying the comprehensive financial data tied to the Preston family's various assets and affiliations. My father's intelligence team had already compiled a meticulous dossier on Beatrice's social standing, correctly recognizing that her power within their circles was entirely dependent on her position as president of the exclusive Oak Ridge Country Club, the very same club where she had hosted our anniversary gala, and the same club where she was currently spreading her malicious lies about me. The country club, like most elite institutions of its kind, relied heavily on discreet financing to maintain its pristine golf courses, lavish facilities, and extravagant social events. I pulled up the debt structure behind Oak Ridge. The club had recently undertaken a massive, multi-million-dollar renovation of its clubhouse and dining facilities, funded through a substantial line of credit from a regional bank. That line of credit was still active, and the underlying debt had been bundled into a larger portfolio managed by a secondary financial institution. I pressed a button on the intercom, connecting me directly to the acquisitions team standing by. I instructed them to initiate the immediate purchase of the entire debt portfolio holding the Oak Ridge Country Club's line of credit. The maneuver was swift, aggressive, and entirely legal from start to finish. Within 20 minutes, the acquisition was fully finalized. Harrison Global was now the primary debt holder for the very institution that served as the foundation of Beatrice's entire social empire. I smiled, a cold, calculated expression that mirrored my father's perfectly. Beatrice believed she controlled the narrative within the walls of that club. She had no idea that I now, quite literally, owned the walls themselves. I set the Oak Ridge Country Club acquisition file aside and shifted my focus firmly back to the primary target. Beatrice's social destruction was, in the end, merely a localized tremor. The absolute financial obliteration of Richard's wealth management firm was the true, impending earthquake still to come. I walked out of my executive office and down the long, glass-lined corridor to the secure financial war room at the very heart of Harrison Global. The space functioned as a command center, filled with blinking servers and wall-to-wall digital displays, tracking global market fluctuations in real time. Inside, 5 of my father's most ruthless forensic accountants were already dissecting the bailout application that Preston and DeAndre had so desperately submitted. I took a seat at the head of the long obsidian conference table. The lead accountant, a sharp-featured man named David, projected a complex, sprawling web of financial transactions onto the main screen. He had been carefully tracing the exact origins of the liquidity Preston claimed his firm possessed in order to qualify for a $150 million bailout from a titan like Harrison Global. Any applicant, after all, had to prove substantial, unencumbered skin in the game. Preston's application boasted a sudden, massive influx of cash over the past 48 hours alone. I instructed David to dig directly into the routing numbers behind those recent deposits. The forensic team unleashed their proprietary algorithms without delay. We watched the data populate in real time, stripping away, layer by layer, the corporate camouflage DeAndre had so meticulously constructed around it. The brilliant corporate lawyer clearly thought he was playing a localized game of financial chess against a handful of provincial regulators. He had absolutely no idea what was actually coming for him. He had no idea he was already being audited by a global financial power that held unrestricted, unquestioned access to international banking backdoors most institutions didn't even know existed. The screen flickered and then lit up in rapid succession, revealing a string of offshore holding accounts stacked one after another like evidence in a case that had already been won. I recognized the Cayman Islands Trust immediately. It was the very one DeAndre had thrown in my face the night he threw me out into the freezing rain. But the money did not stop there. It never does. David isolated the digital paper trail with the calm precision of a surgeon. The funds had been aggressively cycled back through a maze of domestic accounts, laundered layer by layer to mask their true origin, before finally being deposited into Preston's primary corporate liquidity pool. The accounting team ran a comparative analysis against the firm's client ledger, cross-referencing every discrepancy line by line. The results flashed across the screen in bright red alert blocks, one after another, until the entire wall seemed to be bleeding numbers. The room fell entirely silent. DeAndre had not simply hidden my stolen savings inside an offshore trust. He had weaponized every dollar of it to meet the stringent liquidity requirements demanded by the Harrison Global bailout application. DeAndre had executed a brazen, highly illegal commingling maneuver. He had systematically raided the escrow accounts of the firm's most vulnerable clients, the people who trusted him least to fail them and most to protect what little they had left. He swept the remaining balances of several elderly investors, drained a local teacher's pension fund down to its last cent, and took every single dollar he had stolen from my historic preservation business. He bundled all of it together and presented the stolen funds on the official application as Preston's own personal, unencumbered capital, as though it had simply appeared out of thin air. I stared at the glowing red lines connecting the stolen client funds directly to Preston's fraudulent balance sheet, tracing them with my eyes the way you might trace a fault line before an earthquake. The sheer arrogant stupidity of what they had done was staggering. DeAndre had facilitated massive wire fraud. Preston had personally signed his name to fabricated federal financial documents in his own handwriting without a flicker of hesitation. They were no longer just terrible husbands and elitist snobs playing at empire. They had crossed, decisively and irreversibly, into severe federal criminality. This was a textbook Securities and Exchange Commission violation of the highest order, the kind prosecutors dream about. David looked across the table at me, sliding a printed dossier of the traced funds forward until it rested directly in front of me. He confirmed what I already knew in my gut. This is not a civil dispute anymore, Naomi. They have committed egregious federal crimes. If we submit this data packet to the regulatory authorities, the FBI will be raiding their corporate headquarters by tomorrow afternoon. I picked up the thick dossier, feeling the incredible, almost physical weight of the evidence pressing into my hands. Preston had mocked me, standing tall in his grand marble foyer, telling me flatly that I had absolutely no money to fight them. DeAndre had threatened to bury me under endless litigation, fully convinced I would be crushed beneath the sheer weight of his superior legal intellect. They believed, without a shadow of doubt, that they were untouchable masters of the universe. Instead, without even realizing it, they had handed me the exact weapon required to completely annihilate them. This single dossier held the absolute power to have DeAndre stripped of his legal license and permanently disbarred, his name erased from every roster he had ever fought to climb. It contained the undeniable proof necessary to put Preston in a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years of his life. Richard's entire legacy, an identity meticulously built on the illusion of superior financial acumen, would collapse into a spectacular, career-ending criminal scandal splashed across every financial paper in the country. I held their complete destruction in my two hands, but simply handing the file over to federal authorities felt too quick, too clean, too impersonal for what they had done to me. I did not want them arrested in the quiet comfort of their own office, blissfully unaware of exactly who had orchestrated their downfall from the shadows. I wanted them to walk willingly, even eagerly, into the trap. I wanted them to look into the eyes of the very woman they had abused and discarded in the freezing rain, and to understand, in that final moment, that she was the absolute architect of their ruin. I set the heavy dossier back down onto the cold, polished obsidian table with a quiet, deliberate finality. I looked at the lead accountant and instructed him to secure the data packet, seal it tight, but withhold it from the regulatory agencies for exactly 24 hours. I then pulled out my encrypted corporate phone and opened the executive scheduling application. I pulled up the pending bailout request submitted by Richard's struggling wealth management firm, flagged urgent, practically begging for immediate review. I bypassed the standard preliminary approval process entirely. I authorized a direct override, granting their firm an immediate in-person meeting to finalize the terms of the $150 million capital injection. I typed out a formal corporate response from the Harrison Global executive desk. The message congratulated them warmly on passing the initial liquidity audit and invited both Richard Preston and DeAndre to our global headquarters for a final signing ceremony at 9 o'clock the following morning. I hit send on the illuminated screen. The trap was now officially, irreversibly set in motion. They were coming to me, blind and confident, to finalize their own total destruction with their own hands. The notification landed in DeAndre's secure corporate inbox precisely at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The subject line was stark and unadorned: Harrison Global Capital Injection Final Review. DeAndre stared at the screen for a long moment. His sharp legal mind instantly recognized the sheer magnitude of the sender. This was not some automated response drafted by a junior analyst. This email had come directly from the executive acquisitions desk of the most ruthless private equity firm on the entire eastern seaboard. DeAndre printed the email and walked briskly down the corridor of the wealth management firm, footsteps echoing with purpose. He bypassed Richard's corner office entirely and headed straight for Preston's suite. He did not knock. He pushed the heavy glass door open and dropped the single sheet of premium paper onto Preston's desk without a word. Preston picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the brief, formal text hungrily. Color rushed back into his face, chasing away the pale, panicked pallor he had worn since early that morning. He read the words aloud, savoring every syllable like a man tasting victory for the first time in weeks. Congratulations on passing the initial liquidity audit. You are invited to our global headquarters for a final signing ceremony at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Preston leaned back deep into his Italian leather chair, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face like oil across water. He let out a sharp bark of laughter that echoed off the glass walls. "We did it," he said, tossing the paper carelessly back onto the desk. "The old man was right all along. You just have to project strength, and the market bends completely to your will." DeAndre walked over to the private bar tucked in the corner of the office and poured 2 glasses of 20-year-old single malt scotch, his movements smooth, unhurried, and thoroughly practiced. "It wasn't just projecting strength, Preston," DeAndre corrected, handing a glass over to his brother-in-law with a faint air of superiority. "It was aggressive, highly creative legal structuring. We insulated the firm's vulnerabilities and presented a flawless balance sheet to the most rigorous auditors in the entire city. We outsmarted Harrison Global at their own game." Preston raised his glass and clinked it firmly against DeAndre's. "To the superior bloodline," Preston mocked, deliberately echoing his father's disastrous toast from the night before, savoring the irony without ever noticing it. "And to the absolute disappearance of my soon-to-be ex-wife. Have you heard a single word from her since we threw her out?" "Not a whisper," DeAndre replied, taking a slow, satisfied sip of the expensive scotch. "She's probably sitting in some cheap motel room right now, finally realizing exactly how completely we dismantled her life. Without access to her funds or her preservation contracts, she has zero leverage left. She is entirely neutralized." Preston strolled over to his humidor and pulled out 2 premium Cuban cigars, handing one over to DeAndre before clipping the end of his own with practiced flair. "It's almost pathetic," Preston scoffed, lighting the cigar and exhaling a thick, curling cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "She actually thought that wiring a couple $100,000 somewhere gave her any real power. She had absolutely no idea she was playing in a league where $150 million is nothing more than a signature on a piece of paper." While the 2 men celebrated their perceived victory with scotch and cigars, blind to the walls closing in around them, Camille was busy executing her own private form of financial triumph elsewhere in the city. DeAndre had texted her the very moment the Harrison Global email arrived, assuring his wife that the firm's liquidity crisis was officially, completely resolved. Armed with the absolute certainty of a massive impending bailout, Camille felt entirely justified in rewarding herself lavishly for all the stress she believed she had endured. She bypassed her personal credit cards, which were already nearing their limits, and reached instead for the black corporate card tied directly to the firm's executive expense account. She marched into the city's most exclusive jewelry boutique with the effortless entitlement of a woman who believed, without question, that she possessed infinite wealth. Camille did not browse. She simply pointed. She selected a matching set of diamond tennis bracelets, a platinum and sapphire necklace dripping with stones, and a limited edition timepiece for DeAndre as a small congratulatory gift. When the boutique manager hesitated, if only slightly, at the staggering final total, Camille simply handed over the heavy metal corporate card without breaking eye contact. "Run it," she commanded, her tone dripping with aristocratic impatience. "And have the items couriered to my estate this evening. I'm not waiting around." The transaction, totaling just under $500,000, processed without a single hitch. The firm's credit lines, artificially inflated through DeAndre's illegal commingling of stolen client funds, absorbed the massive charge as though it were nothing at all. Camille walked out of the boutique feeling utterly invincible, entirely oblivious to the fact that she had just charged $500,000 to an account that was, at that very moment, under active surveillance by federal forensic accountants. Back at the firm, DeAndre returned to his office riding a surge of absolute dominance. The Harrison Global deal was secured. His aggressive legal maneuvering had, in his mind, single-handedly saved the family empire from collapse. There was only one loose end left to tie off. He picked up his phone and dialed the number belonging to the woman he had systematically blocked from accessing any of her own assets. The call went straight to voicemail, exactly as he had anticipated. DeAndre waited patiently for the beep, a cruel, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Naomi," DeAndre began, his voice dropping into its most intimidating, authoritative register. "I'm calling to formally notify you that I have officially filed the divorce petition in absentia with the state court. Given your continued failure to respond or retain counsel, we are proceeding with a default judgment." He paused deliberately, relishing the power he believed he held over her entire future. "I also want to inform you that your preservation contracts have been permanently reassigned. Your reputation in this city is entirely finished. I strongly suggest you take the $5,000 relocation fee I offered and leave the state while you still can. If you attempt to contest this divorce or contact this family again, I will personally ensure you are held liable for the entirety of our legal fees. You played a very stupid game, Naomi, and in the end, you lost absolutely everything." DeAndre ended the call and tossed the phone carelessly onto his desk. He checked his watch. It was 5:30 in the evening. He packed his briefcase, ready to head home and celebrate properly with Camille. Tomorrow morning, they would sign the paperwork with Harrison Global, and their financial supremacy would be permanently, gloriously restored. 10 miles away, high above the shimmering city skyline, I stood alone in my executive office at Harrison Global. The storm from the previous night had finally cleared, leaving the city washed clean and glittering under the late afternoon sun like something newly forged. I was dressed in a bespoke tailored charcoal suit, the fabric moving against my skin like a second layer of armor. The bruise on my cheek was expertly concealed beneath a thin layer of makeup, but the cold, calculating fury simmering beneath it remained entirely, unmistakably visible to anyone who dared to look closely. I held my encrypted corporate phone in my hand, listening once more to the voicemail DeAndre had just left. His arrogant, threatening words echoed through the silent, glass-walled office, bouncing off every surface. He truly believed he had won. He believed, with total confidence, that he had crushed me beneath the sheer weight of his superior intellect and legal maneuvering. I let the voicemail play through to the very end without flinching. I did not feel fear. I did not feel intimidation. I felt instead a terrifying, absolute calm settle over me like a second skin. I placed the phone face down on my heavy mahogany desk. I reached forward and pressed the silver intercom button, connecting me directly to the lead forensic accountant stationed in the financial war room several floors below. "David," I said, my voice perfectly level, stripped clean of any emotion. "Yes, Ms. Harrison," the accountant replied instantly, alert and ready. "The audit is complete." "Freeze their corporate accounts," I instructed, staring out at the city they thought they controlled without ever truly owning it. "All of them, effective at exactly 9 a.m. tomorrow morning." While I sat quietly in my office at Harrison Global, watching the clock inch steadily closer to 9, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law remained completely, blissfully oblivious to what was coming for them. Beatrice and Camille started their day early, driven by the absolute certainty that Preston and Richard were, at that very moment, finalizing a massive bailout that would secure their futures forever. In their minds, the family empire was already saved. To properly celebrate their perceived triumph, they indulged in an extravagant morning shopping spree at the most exclusive luxury boutique on the city's wealthiest avenue. The boutique itself was a sanctuary of high fashion, all Italian marble floors and plush velvet seating designed to make ordinary customers feel small. Beatrice and Camille glided through the glass doors at precisely 8:45, moving as though they personally owned the building and everything inside it. They demanded, without so much as a hello, the immediate and undivided attention of the store manager. A sharply dressed man named Francois ordered his staff to bring out trays of sparkling water at once. He hovered attentively around the two women as they browsed, pointing out items with a kind of lazy, practiced arrogance meant to flatter rather than sell. Camille was particularly aggressive in her selections that morning, emboldened by the $500,000 she had so successfully charged the previous evening. She felt completely, unshakably invincible. She directed the sales associates to pull 3 limited-edition leather handbags, 5 pairs of custom runway shoes, and a heavily embellished evening gown that had only just arrived from Milan. Beatrice matched her daughter-in-law's enthusiasm blow for blow, piling vintage silk scarves and diamond-encrusted accessories onto the checkout counter without a hint of restraint. They laughed loudly, discussing upcoming winter vacations and praising Preston's supposed business genius, making certain that every wealthy patron nearby overheard exactly how thriving their fund apparently was. The clock ticked steadily forward. It was exactly 9 o'clock. At that precise second, my forensic accounting team executed the absolute freeze directive across the entire financial network tied to Richard's firm. The digital locks slammed shut simultaneously on the corporate accounts, the personal offshore trusts, the escrow holdings, and every single credit line DeAndre had illegally inflated over the past several months. The flow of stolen liquidity was instantly, completely severed, as though a valve had simply been shut. It was 9:05 when Beatrice and Camille finally approached the polished mahogany checkout counter to finalize their massive haul for the morning. Francois stood behind the register, smiling warmly as his assistants carefully wrapped each designer piece in crisp tissue paper. The total purchase amounted to just over $120,000. Camille did not even blink at the staggering number. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her heavy platinum corporate card, dropping it onto the counter with a loud, confident clack. Francois picked up the card and inserted it smoothly into the encrypted payment terminal, tapping the screen and waiting for the familiar, reassuring approval chime. Instead, the machine emitted a harsh, sharp beep. A glaring red error message flashed abruptly across the digital display. Francois frowned, pulling the card back out and wiping the chip carefully against his sleeve. "My apologies, madam," he said, his voice still smooth and reassuring. "It seems we have a slight connection error somewhere. Allow me to try running it one more time." He inserted the platinum card again. The machine buzzed sharply and declined it instantly, without hesitation. Camille rolled her eyes, letting out an exaggerated sigh of pure annoyance. "The bank is probably placing a fraud hold on it simply because the purchase is so large," she stated flatly, waving her hand dismissively at the whole inconvenience. "Just force it through manually, Francois." "Madame, my husband is closing an enormous deal this very morning. I am afraid I cannot override a hard decline coming directly from the issuing bank," Francois replied, his fawning demeanor cooling noticeably. "Madame," Francois added a moment later, his tone shifting entirely. "The terminal is explicitly instructing me to retain the card." Beatrice stepped forward at once, her face flushing a deep, indignant red. "Do not be ridiculous," she snapped, snatching the platinum card off the counter before Francois could reach for it. "Their system is obviously malfunctioning. Here, use my card instead." Beatrice produced an exclusive black metal card tied directly to Richard's primary executive account and handed it over with a triumphant little smirk, fully expecting the problem to resolve itself instantly. Francois processed the black card. The terminal beeped a third time. A red light illuminated the counter. Declined. The polite smile vanished completely from Francois's face. He placed the black card back down onto the mahogany surface and took a deliberate, unmistakable step backward. "I am very sorry, ladies," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet boutique. "Both of your primary accounts have been entirely declined by your respective financial institutions. Do you perhaps have another form of payment you would like to provide?" He spoke loudly enough that several of the other elite shoppers stopped browsing entirely and turned to stare. The wealthy patrons exchanged eager, whispered comments behind cupped hands. In their hyper-competitive social circle, a publicly declined credit card was the single greatest mark of shame imaginable. Beatrice turned a violent shade of pale. She snatched her black card off the counter, hands trembling with a volatile mixture of rage and sudden rising panic. "This is completely unacceptable," she hissed, keeping her voice low in a desperate attempt to avoid further embarrassment. "Richard is meeting with Harrison Global right this very moment. I will call him and have this fixed immediately." Beatrice pulled out her phone and dialed her husband's private number, pacing anxiously back and forth across the marble floor. The line rang repeatedly before transferring at last to voicemail. Richard was sitting quietly in my glass boardroom, entirely cut off from the outside world. Camille felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She pulled out her own phone, manicured fingers trembling slightly as she bypassed her contacts entirely, and dialed DeAndre's direct line instead. She turned away from the staring crowd, desperate to hide her rising hysteria from prying eyes. DeAndre answered on the second ring, striding confidently through the marble lobby of his law office, preparing to review the final bailout documents one last time. "What is it, Camille?" he asked, mildly irritated at the interruption. "DeAndre, you need to fix the bank accounts right now," Camille hissed frantically into the phone. "My platinum card just declined, and Mom's executive black card declined too. Call the bank and clear the fraud hold immediately, do you understand me?" DeAndre stopped walking abruptly. His polished leather shoes halted dead in the center of the lobby. He pulled out his encrypted smartphone and quickly opened his secure banking application, expecting nothing more than a standard temporary hold. Instead, DeAndre realized with a jolt that every single account tied to the family firm was locked entirely, flagged due to suspicious activity pending investor review. DeAndre stared at his phone screen, refusing at first to believe the harsh red notification displaying the lock across all family accounts. Camille was screaming on the other end of the line, demanding he fix the declined cards immediately, but her frantic voice sounded suddenly distant, like faint static beneath water. He abruptly ended the call, severing her panicked demands without offering a single word of reassurance in return. The corporate lawyer stood perfectly still in the center of his own prestigious law firm lobby, holding the smartphone in a trembling hand. This was not some standard banking error or a simple fraud hold that could be talked away. The specific phrasing indicated a catastrophic intervention from a far higher financial authority. Suspicious activity pending investor review meant the institutional backers had triggered a complete, structural freeze on every single asset tied to both Richard and Preston. DeAndre forced his breathing to slow, drawing on years of cutthroat legal experience to suppress his rapidly rising panic. He shoved the phone into his tailored suit pocket and adjusted his cuffs, hurriedly reassembling his usual mask of arrogant invincibility. He needed to reach his private office immediately, access the secure terminal, and manually override the freeze using his emergency backdoor protocols. He took a confident step forward and then stopped dead in his tracks. The atmosphere in the grand marble lobby was completely wrong. The firm usually buzzed with the energetic hum of paralegals rushing between meetings, phones ringing, printers humming. Today, an eerie, suffocating silence hung heavily over everything. DeAndre looked toward the front reception desk. His lead secretary, a veteran administrative professional who had never once lost her composure in 15 years, was standing rigid behind her mahogany counter. Her face was entirely drained of color. She clutched a thick stack of manila folders against her chest and stared at DeAndre with absolute, unmistakable terror in her eyes. Before DeAndre could even ask her what was wrong, 3 men rose in unison from the leather waiting chairs. They did not look anything like the wealthy corporate clients who typically frequented the firm. They wore cheap, off-the-rack gray suits and sensible rubber-soled shoes. They moved with a synchronized, predatory efficiency that instantly triggered every defense mechanism buried deep in DeAndre's highly trained legal mind. The lead investigator, a tall man with a severe buzz cut and a completely emotionless face, walked directly toward DeAndre without breaking stride. He did not extend his hand for a polite greeting. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced a black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a shining silver badge bearing the seal of the federal government. "We are forensic auditors acting on behalf of the Securities and Exchange Commission," the lead investigator announced, his voice carrying clearly and coldly across the silent lobby. "We received an anonymous, heavily documented tip regarding severe irregularities in this firm's financial management. We are executing an immediate emergency audit of all corporate escrow holdings linked to your wealth management partners. You are hereby directed to surrender all administrative access to your digital servers and physical filing cabinets. Do not attempt to log into your workstation. Do not attempt to destroy any documents. You are officially under federal investigation, effective immediately." The words hit DeAndre with the devastating force of a heavy physical blow, knocking the air clean out of his lungs. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped animal desperate for escape. The mask of arrogant invincibility shattered completely, leaving nothing behind but raw, paralyzing terror. The federal government was never supposed to be here. He had hidden the financial crimes behind layers upon layers of complex offshore holding companies and deliberately convoluted corporate structures. He had genuinely believed himself untouchable. But the sudden, unannounced arrival of the Securities and Exchange Commission meant the entire paper trail connecting Naomi's stolen funds to the Cayman Islands Trust was now completely, irreversibly exposed. Someone had spoon-fed the federal authorities the exact roadmap required to dismantle his lucrative legal career, brick by brick. DeAndre realized with sickening clarity that his arrogant maneuvering had become a massive, inescapable liability overnight. The illegal commingling of stolen client funds was no longer a brilliant strategy for securing a bailout. It was, instead, a direct, one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary cell. He had authorized wire fraud with his own hands. He had falsified official banking documents under his own signature. He had knowingly drained the life savings of vulnerable investors simply to artificially inflate Preston's liquidity numbers. The federal auditors would trace the money flowing directly from Naomi's stolen business accounts into the fraudulent balance sheets submitted to Harrison Global. The evidence at this point was absolute and undeniable. He would be stripped of his law license, publicly humiliated in front of the entire legal community, and permanently disbarred before the week was even over. The lead investigator stepped closer, handing DeAndre a thick stack of legal warrants without ceremony. "We need the encryption keys for the primary escrow accounts immediately," the investigator demanded, his tone laced with undisguised contempt. "Do not make this any more difficult than it already has to be. We currently have tactical teams waiting at your partner wealth management firm as we speak. We are locking down absolutely everything in this building floor by floor." DeAndre felt his knees weaken beneath him. He was trapped, surrounded entirely by federal agents inside his own lobby. There was no way out of the building and no legal loophole clever enough to save him from the undeniable proof of his own crimes. He needed to warn Preston immediately. The bailout meeting was a trap, an elaborate one, and he had walked straight into it with his eyes wide open. Whoever had sent the anonymous tip to the federal government had perfectly timed its execution to coincide precisely with the Harrison Global signing ceremony. DeAndre desperately reached back into his pocket and pulled out his phone, fingers shaking uncontrollably as he fumbled with the screen. He bypassed the security lock and hit Preston's speed dial. The line began to ring. 10 miles away, the oblivious vice president strode confidently through the glass doors of Harrison Global headquarters, entirely unaware that his world was quietly collapsing behind him. Preston ignored the phone buzzing insistently in his pocket, assuming it was simply Camille calling to complain about her shopping trip. He flashed his most arrogant smile at the security desk, oblivious to how quickly everything was falling apart. Preston stepped smoothly into the private executive elevator leading up to the highest floor. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing him inside the luxury cabin, the cell signal dropped away entirely, leaving DeAndre's frantic warning forever undelivered. The elevator began its rapid ascent, carrying Preston directly into the execution chamber waiting for him above. The heavy steel doors sealed shut, trapping Preston in a silent ascent toward the pinnacle of Harrison Global headquarters, unaware he was rising directly into the center of his own reckoning. He stood beside his father, Richard, who had boarded the adjacent private elevator from the underground garage just moments before, meeting his son at last in the polished marble lobby of the 60th floor. The transition from the chaotic city streets below to the hushed, fiercely controlled environment of the private equity titan was jarring, almost disorienting. The architecture itself seemed engineered purely to intimidate. Soaring ceilings composed of dark obsidian slate met floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a vertigo-inducing view of the entire financial district sprawled out below. There were no warm colors anywhere, no comfortable waiting areas, and absolutely no artwork left to distract the eye from the cold, deliberate power of the room. Every single angle of the space communicated ruthless efficiency and unlimited wealth, the kind of controlled luxury that whispered rather than shouted. Preston adjusted his silk tie, feeling a sudden strange drop somewhere deep in his stomach. He chalked it up to the rapid elevation change from the elevator ride, but the sheer scale of the Harrison Global operation was already beginning to weigh heavily on him, pressing down on his chest like a physical thing. Standing in this fortress of shadow and glass, he realized for the first time in his life that he and his father were nothing more than a tiny, insignificant speck of dust. A woman in a sharp charcoal uniform approached them, moving silently across the polished floor as though her heels made no sound at all. She did not smile. She did not offer them a polite greeting, nor did she ask how their morning was going. She merely looked at them with cold, calculated professionalism and instructed them, in a clipped tone, to follow her. Richard puffed out his chest, attempting to project his usual arrogant authority, but the receptionist did not even blink. She turned sharply and led them down a long, sterile corridor lined with frosted glass walls that seemed to swallow the sound of their own footsteps. They were ushered into a massive executive boardroom. The entire space was enclosed in thick, soundproof glass, dominated by a long table carved from a single slab of petrified wood. There were no chairs waiting on their side of the table, only two sleek leather stools positioned directly across from a massive, high-backed executive chair that sat empty, like a throne. The unspoken power dynamic could not have been clearer. They were not here as equal partners. They were here as supplicants, hats in hand, begging for a financial lifeline. The receptionist informed them the executive review committee would arrive shortly. She turned on her heel and exited the room, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind her with a solid, definitive click that echoed like a verdict. The complete silence of the room instantly swallowed them whole. Richard walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city with a tight, nervous smile plastered across his face. He clapped his hands together, rubbing his palms in eager anticipation. "We made it, Preston," Richard said, his voice echoing faintly in the vast empty space. $150 million. This changes absolutely everything for our family legacy. The old guard might look down their noses at our aggressive strategies, but once we secure this capital infusion, nobody will ever dare question our supremacy again. Preston nodded and took a seat on one of the leather stools. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on the petrified wood table, but found he could not sit still. The oppressive silence of the room was beginning to gnaw steadily at his nerves. He kept checking his expensive watch, tapping his foot against the slate floor. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The promised executive review committee had not materialized. At the 30-minute mark, the pristine illusion of their impending victory began, very slightly, to fracture. Richard's cell phone buzzed violently inside his tailored jacket pocket. The sudden noise was deafening in the silent boardroom, cutting through the stillness like a gunshot. Richard pulled the device out, frowning at the screen. He swiped to decline the call, but the phone immediately began vibrating again, insistent and relentless. He let out an irritated sigh and looked at the barrage of frantic text messages flooding his notification screen. It was Beatrice. She was sending dozens of messages in rapid succession, one after another. The preview text on the locked screen displayed chaotic, fragmented sentences demanding immediate attention. Richard caught glimpses of phrases like declined cards, humiliated, completely cut off, and fix this right now, each one more frantic than the last. Preston watched his father's face contort with a mixture of confusion and intense irritation. "What is it?" Preston asked, shifting uncomfortably on his stool. "Is DeAndre trying to get through with some last-minute legal amendment?" Richard scowled, pressing the power button on his phone to silence the relentless buzzing entirely. "It's just your mother," Richard replied, shoving the phone back into his pocket with a dismissive gesture. "She's having some sort of dramatic meltdown at a boutique. Apparently, there's a temporary fraud hold on the corporate accounts, and she's throwing a tantrum because her black card was declined. It's incredibly bad timing, but it's nothing we need to worry about right now. DeAndre will handle the bank authorization. We cannot afford to be distracted. Not today." Preston felt a brief flash of unease, remembering the strange drop in cell service right before he'd stepped into the elevator. He wondered, just for a moment, whether DeAndre was actually handling the situation or whether something else entirely had triggered the sudden financial blockage. But he pushed the thought away just as quickly, burying it beneath his towering ego. His father was right. A minor banking glitch was entirely irrelevant when they were mere moments away from securing a $150 million bailout. 45 minutes had now passed since they were first escorted into the glass boardroom. Richard paced the length of the room, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the dark slate floor with every step. He checked his watch for what felt like the dozenth time. "They're making us sweat," Richard muttered under his breath. "It's a classic power play, nothing more." Suddenly, the heavy double doors swung open. Purposeful footsteps echoed down the corridor outside. The thick glass door was pushed open by a guard. A team of 5 elite corporate lawyers filed inside, moving with a kind of predatory precision, each one carrying thick manila folders sealed with red federal security tape. They simply stared at Richard and Preston with clinical, professional hostility, saying nothing at all. Then the final figure stepped through the heavy oak doors. A woman dressed in a sharp, dark, bespoke charcoal suit walked purposefully toward the massive, high-backed executive chair, her heels striking the slate floor with unhurried confidence. Preston kept his head bowed, obsessively reviewing the final projections on his legal pad, refusing to let the intimidating atmosphere break his concentration. He needed this pitch to be absolutely flawless. He muttered under his breath, rehearsing the opening lines about market stability and generational wealth for what felt like the 100th time. Beside him, Richard let out a loud, arrogant scoff that echoed sharply across the vast glass boardroom. He crossed his arms and glared at the woman approaching the head of the table. "What on earth are you doing here?" Richard demanded, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Did they seriously send my disgraced daughter-in-law in here to bring us coffee? If this is some kind of pathetic attempt to beg for your marriage back, you have chosen the single worst possible moment. Get out of here before you ruin the most important meeting of our entire lives. We are not going to let you ruin this very important deal for us, today or any other day." Preston finally stopped rehearsing his pitch, snapping his head up, irritated by the sudden disruption. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly against the petrified wood surface. Preston froze completely. All the air seemed to vanish instantly from his lungs. The woman standing before them was not holding a silver coffee tray. She was not crying, and she was certainly not begging. She was flanked by a team of 5 elite corporate lawyers who treated her with absolute, terrifying reverence, the kind reserved only for the most powerful people in any room. The dark purple bruise on her cheekbone was expertly concealed, but her eyes were entirely, completely unrecognizable. They belonged, unmistakably, to a ruthless apex predator. Naomi did not offer Richard a single word of response. She did not even acknowledge his petty insult with so much as a glance. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace and took her seat directly in the massive high-backed executive chair, settling into it as though it had always belonged to her. The 5 corporate lawyers immediately took their positions, standing silently behind her like a royal guard flanking their queen. Naomi reached forward and placed her hands flat against the polished table. She looked at Preston, and then at Richard, letting the silence stretch between them. Her silence was a weapon, and she wielded it with devastating surgical precision. Richard shifted uncomfortably on his leather stool. His arrogant posture began to crumble, slowly, under the crushing weight of her silent stare. He opened his mouth to issue another command, but the words died somewhere in his throat before they could reach his lips. Naomi reached out and pulled the thick manila folder toward her. The folder was sealed with red federal security tape. She broke the seal with a sharp, decisive snap that seemed to echo through the room. She flipped open the heavy cover, revealing the exact $150 million bailout portfolio Preston and DeAndre had so desperately submitted to Harrison Global just hours earlier. "Let us begin the final liquidity audit," Naomi stated, her voice perfectly level and devoid of any human empathy whatsoever. She did not look at either man as she spoke. She looked only at the fraudulent numbers laid out in front of her. "You claim a primary unencumbered capital pool of $40 million. You listed this as immediate cash on hand, available for cross-collateralization against the commercial real estate development in the tech corridor." She turned the page, her movement slow and deliberate, almost ceremonial. "However, my forensic accounting team ran a complete routing analysis on these specific deposits over the past 48 hours. This liquidity is not unencumbered. It is not even yours. You engaged your corporate lawyer to execute a highly illegal commingling maneuver. You systematically drained the escrow accounts of your most vulnerable clients to artificially inflate your balance sheet." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He looked at Preston with wide, terrified eyes, silently pleading for some kind of answer his son did not have. Preston was completely paralyzed. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at all. The pristine illusion of their financial supremacy was being ripped apart, piece by piece, by the very woman he had locked out in the freezing rain just hours before. Naomi turned another page, highlighting a section of the document with a silver pen. "You then routed these stolen funds through a series of shell corporations before depositing them into an irrevocable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands, a trust legally registered to your sister, Camille. You attempted to use federally protected client money to secure a private equity bailout, committing wire fraud and severe securities violations in the process. You thought you could mask the deficit. But your architecture was fundamentally, fatally flawed from the very beginning." The sheer accuracy of her dismantling was breathtaking. She was reading their financial death sentence aloud, line by line, exposing every single criminal shortcut they had taken to keep their sinking empire afloat for just a little longer. Richard began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the reality of federal prison materialized before his eyes with sickening clarity. He realized, all at once, that the bank freeze Beatrice had panicked over that morning was not some temporary glitch. It was an execution order. Preston reached his absolute breaking point. The crushing humiliation of being systematically destroyed by his own discarded wife was too much for his fragile, towering ego to bear. The terror of impending federal charges morphed instantly into blind, desperate rage. He slammed his open hand down onto the petrified wood table with a deafening crack that rattled the heavy glass walls of the boardroom. "Shut your mouth!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic and fury. "I don't know how you got into this building, or who you slept with to get your hands on our private financial documents, but you are going to stop talking right now. You are a delusional, glorified construction worker. You have absolutely no authority here. Get out of this boardroom immediately before you ruin this deal and destroy our entire family." Naomi did not flinch at his outburst, not even slightly. She simply closed the heavy manila folder with a soft, deliberate motion. She leaned forward, closing the physical distance between them across the massive table. She reached into the pocket of her bespoke charcoal suit and pulled out a single thick piece of premium cardstock. With a swift flick of her wrist, she slid the business card across the polished surface. It glided silently, stopping exactly an inch from Preston's trembling hands. Preston looked down at the thick premium cardstock resting on the petrified wood. His eyes locked onto the embossed silver lettering. He blinked once, trying desperately to process the information. He blinked twice. His lips parted, but the air seemed to have completely vanished from the room around him. The text was impossible to misunderstand. It read, "Naomi Harrison, Executive Vice President and Majority Shareholder." The heavy silence in the glass boardroom stretched out into an eternity. Preston dropped his gaze from the card to the woman sitting at the head of the table. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. The arrogant snarl he had worn just seconds earlier completely melted away, replaced by a profound, paralyzing terror. He finally understood the magnitude of his catastrophic error. He had not simply slapped his wife. He had struck the sole heir to the very empire he was currently on his knees, begging for financial salvation. His entire world was collapsing right before his eyes. Richard leaned over to look at the business card. His eyes scanned the silver text, and a violent shudder wrecked his entire body from head to toe. He grabbed at his chest, his breathing turning into shallow, rapid gasps. The older man began to hyperventilate in earnest, the reality of their impending doom crushing his lungs like a physical weight. The elite wealth management fund he had spent decades building was now, entirely and irrevocably, at the mercy of the very woman he had publicly humiliated the night before. Richard slumped back onto his leather stool, gripping the edge of the table to keep from sliding onto the dark slate floor entirely. He tried to speak, tried to formulate some kind of apology or plea, but his throat was entirely paralyzed by shock. The walls were closing in on him from every direction. His legacy was already dead and buried. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not yell, and she did not display a single ounce of the vindictive rage they might have expected from a discarded, humiliated spouse. She spoke instead with a terrifying, absolute calm that chilled the blood in their veins far more effectively than shouting ever could have. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Preston," she began, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "You believed you could take my hard-earned money, the capital I built preserving historic foundations with my own two hands, and simply erase my claim to it. You allowed your corporate lawyer to funnel my savings into an offshore trust bearing your sister's name. You looked me directly in the eye while taking my money to plug the holes in your sinking ship. And when I dared to speak the truth at your precious anniversary gala, you struck me across the face and locked me out in the freezing rain. You treated me like absolute garbage." Preston began to tremble uncontrollably, his hands shaking so violently they rattled audibly against the table. Naomi leaned slightly forward, locking her dark eyes onto his panicked gaze. "But my money was not enough to save you. she continued, her tone clinical and devastating. When my capital failed to cover your massive leverage, you turned to your own clients. You raided the pension funds of hardworking teachers. You drained the escrow accounts of elderly investors who trusted your family's legacy with their entire life savings. You stole from vulnerable people to artificially inflate your balance sheet in a desperate bid to qualify for this exact bailout. You thought you could commit federal wire fraud and hide it behind aggressive legal posturing. You truly believed you were untouchable, masters of the financial universe. You thought completely, catastrophically wrong. Richard let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his face buried entirely in his hands. Naomi shifted her gaze toward her father-in-law, showing absolutely zero pity in her expression. You stood at that podium, Richard, and mocked my lack of pedigree. You called me a charity case in front of an entire room of your closest friends. You boasted about your superior bloodline while actively committing severe financial crimes to maintain the mere illusion of your wealth. You desperately wanted to enter the realm of true global power. Well, Richard, you have finally, truly arrived. Welcome to Harrison Global. I do hope you enjoy the view from up here. Preston opened his mouth, a desperate plea already forming on his trembling lips. Naomi, please, he choked out, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. We can fix this terrible error. I can explain the restructuring. It was all legal strategy, I swear it to you. We can make you whole again. We can restore everything. We are still legally married. I truly love you, Naomi. Naomi smiled, a cold, empty expression that offered zero salvation, zero warmth, zero mercy of any kind. There is no making me whole, Preston, she stated softly, almost gently. Because there is nothing left of your firm to salvage. I am not here to negotiate a settlement. I am here to personally oversee your financial execution. Your entire legacy dies today, in this room. Before Preston could utter another pathetic excuse, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom burst open with a violent crash that shattered the tense atmosphere instantly. DeAndre sprinted into the room, his usually immaculate appearance completely destroyed. The corporate lawyer was sweating profusely, his tailored suit jacket flying open and his tie hanging loose around his neck like a noose. He was clutching his encrypted smartphone in one hand, breathing heavily from a dead sprint across the entire building. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He had run the whole way up from the lobby. "Preston, we are finished," DeAndre shouted, his voice echoing with panic, completely ignoring everyone else in the room. "The federal auditors are in the lobby right now. The Securities and Exchange Commission just froze every single asset we possess. They have the offshore routing numbers. They know all about the Cayman Islands Trust. We are facing federal indictments by noon. We need to surrender immediately." DeAndre took 2 more steps toward the table and then suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His frantic eyes finally registered the imposing woman sitting confidently in the massive high-backed executive chair at the head of the mahogany table. The breath caught in his throat as the absolute realization struck him like a physical blow. He knew exactly what this meant. He understood, with sickening clarity, that he had walked directly into a perfectly orchestrated trap, and that he was now, completely and irreversibly, ruined. DeAndre stood frozen in the doorway, his chest heaving as he stared at the woman he had evicted just 48 hours earlier. The sheer magnitude of his miscalculation crashed down upon him, crushing the brilliant legal mind he had always weaponized so casually against others. He looked at Richard, hyperventilating on his stool, and then at Preston, who was completely paralyzed with fear. The trap had snapped shut, and there was absolutely no escape from the glass boardroom now. Naomi did not offer DeAndre a greeting of any kind. She simply shifted her gaze back to her father-in-law, Richard. The older man was struggling to draw breath, his hands clutching at his chest as he watched his entire empire evaporate in real time. Naomi picked up the bailout application and held it suspended over the petrified wood table. Richard, your request for a $150 million capital injection is officially and permanently denied, Naomi stated, her voice ringing with total finality. Because your firm is massively overleveraged and entirely dependent on this specific influx of cash, you will breach your loan covenants within the hour. Your creditors have already been notified of our decision by my executive staff. You will be forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy before 5 o'clock this very evening. The legacy you spent your entire life building, the very same legacy you used to justify my public humiliation, is now completely, permanently dead. You are financially ruined, and your name will be synonymous with catastrophic failure in this city for the next century. Richard let out a strangled gasp. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cold, polished table, utterly defeated and destroyed. Naomi then turned her dark, piercing eyes toward the doorway where DeAndre remained frozen in place. Her gaze was clinical, stripping away his expensive suit and his arrogant demeanor layer by layer until nothing remained but a terrified criminal standing exposed. DeAndre, you thought you were the smartest man in any room you ever walked into, Naomi said evenly. You orchestrated the theft of my personal savings, and you built a fraudulent offshore trust to hide your extensive crimes. You threatened to bury me in endless litigation, assuming I was a helpless victim who lacked the resources to fight back. DeAndre took a hesitant step forward, his expensive leather shoes suddenly feeling like lead weights bolted to the floor. His throat had gone completely dry. Naomi reached to her right and picked up a thick file. She slid it forcefully across the massive mahogany table, stopping precisely at the edge, right in front of DeAndre. He looked down at the label, recognizing instantly the internal routing codes belonging to his own law firm. Open it, Naomi commanded, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. DeAndre reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the cover. Inside lay the undeniable proof of his wire fraud, bank transfers, unauthorized client withdrawals, and the exact digital signatures connecting him directly to the Cayman Islands accounts. The evidence was absolute and entirely damning, laid out in black and white for anyone to see. You told me I did not have the money for a lawyer, DeAndre, Naomi said, leaning back in her high-backed executive chair with an air of quiet satisfaction. You were right. I did not need one. I bought your firm's parent company this morning. You are fired, and you will be disbarred. DeAndre gasped, gripping the edge of the table to steady his shaking frame. The reality of her words meant his career had just been instantly, permanently obliterated. He was no longer a partner at a prestigious firm. He was now nothing more than an unemployed federal suspect facing decades behind bars. The forensic auditors currently raiding your lobby were personally dispatched by my acquisitions team, Naomi continued relentlessly, without a hint of mercy. They have the encryption keys, and they are seizing every single asset you thought you had so cleverly hidden. By the time you take the elevator back down to the ground floor, federal agents will already be waiting to place you in handcuffs. Your wife, Camille, is currently experiencing the decline of her platinum credit cards across the city as we speak. I have also initiated the immediate foreclosure on the luxury estate you both reside in, since it was listed as collateral in your fraudulent loan applications. You are going to federal prison, DeAndre, and your wife is going to be sleeping on the street. DeAndre collapsed onto the leather stool, his face buried entirely in his hands, shaking uncontrollably as the full weight of his total destruction finally settled over him. The boardroom descended into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the ragged breathing of the two ruined men slumped in their seats. Naomi turned her full attention to the man sitting across from her. Preston had watched his father and his brother-in-law get systematically dismantled in a matter of minutes, one after the other. The arrogant wealth manager who had slapped her across the face and thrown her out into the freezing rain was now stripped bare of his money, his status, and his false sense of superiority. Preston looked at Naomi, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic panic. He realized with a sinking dread that he was the very last target remaining on her list. The sheer terror of losing everything broke the fragile remnants of his towering ego completely. He could not maintain the facade of a powerful executive for even one more second. Preston pushed himself off the leather stool, his legs trembling so violently they could barely support his own weight. He did not yell, and he did not demand respect. He took 2 unsteady steps toward the head of the table and then collapsed entirely. He fell onto his knees, hitting the dark slate floor with a loud, echoing thud. He crawled forward until he was positioned directly at Naomi's feet, his suit wrinkling badly against the cold stone beneath him. "Naomi, please," Preston begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. Tears streamed down his face in earnest. "I will change. I promise I will leave the other woman. I will end the affair today, I swear it." "It was not my fault," Preston sobbed, shifting the blame with pathetic eagerness onto anyone but himself. "It was my father. He forced me to take the aggressive positions, and DeAndre orchestrated the fraud. They manipulated me, Naomi. You have to spare me. Please, Naomi, I am begging you on my hands and knees." Preston remained there on the dark slate floor. His expensive suit was ruined by the awkward way he had crawled toward the massive table. Tears streamed steadily down his face. He clasped his hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. He looked nothing at all like the arrogant wealth manager who had paraded so confidently through the country club gala just 48 hours earlier. His face was blotchy and red. Saliva pooled at the corners of his mouth as he babbled through incoherent apologies, one running into the next. He offered to sell his cars to pay me back. He offered to publicly apologize to my colleagues in front of everyone. He even offered to testify against his own father and brother-in-law in federal court, if only I would grant him mercy. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed executive chair. I looked down at the man I had called my husband for an entire decade. I felt absolutely zero pity for him. The 5 elite corporate lawyers standing behind me remained completely, professionally silent. They watched the pathetic display unfold with cold, clinical detachment. Richard was slumped over the table, gasping for air as his financial empire evaporated around him. DeAndre remained frozen in the doorway, utterly paralyzed by his impending disbarment and federal indictment. The entire glass boardroom felt suffocating, airless, final. I placed my hands flat against the polished, petrified wood surface. I pushed my chair back slowly. The scrape of the chair legs against the slate floor echoed loudly throughout the quiet room. I stood up to my full height. I smoothed the front of my bespoke charcoal suit with a single, deliberate motion. I stepped away from the head of the table and began walking toward Preston. The sharp click of my heels against the stone floor sounded like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of his privileged, entitled life. The entire room held its breath. Richard stopped gasping and looked up with wide, terrified eyes. DeAndre swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe for support. Preston stopped his pathetic babbling entirely. He looked up at me from his knees, trembling like a cornered animal. He braced himself, shutting his eyes tightly. He genuinely expected physical violence. He expected me to strike him across the face in front of his ruined family and my own team of lawyers. He expected me to exact physical revenge for the brutal assault I had suffered at his hands only 2 nights before. I stopped exactly 2 feet in front of him. I looked down at his cowering form without blinking. I did not raise my hand, not once. I did not clench my fists. I spoke instead with a terrifying, gentle softness that cut far deeper than any shouted threat ever could have managed. I told myself I would make you pay for that slap. My voice was smooth and perfectly controlled, without a single tremor. I spent the last 48 hours imagining the exact moment I would return the favor. I thought about how satisfying it would feel to strike you down and watch you bleed on this pristine floor, just like you made me bleed on the marble floor of the country club. Preston kept his eyes squeezed shut, a fresh wave of tears leaking from the corners. He let out a pathetic, involuntary whimper. "But hitting you back would make me like you," I continued, my tone devoid of any human warmth whatsoever. Striking a defenseless, pathetic creature is a complete coward's tactic. It is the action of a weak, small man who desperately needs to prove his dominance because he possesses absolutely no real power of his own. I am not a coward, Preston, and I am certainly not weak. Therefore, I will not lay a single finger on you today. Instead, I am taking the only thing that ever made you feel like a man. I turned my back on him and walked to the mahogany table. I picked up a thin black folder my lead attorney had prepared for me that very morning. I walked back and tossed the folder onto the floor directly in front of Preston's trembling knees. The folder slid open, revealing a crisp legal document bearing the official seal of the state court. "That is your revised divorce decree," I stated, looking down at his panicked face without any hint of softness left. DeAndre was very kind to file the initial paperwork in absentia yesterday afternoon. It saved my legal team a significant amount of administrative time. However, we made a few mandatory adjustments to the asset division clauses. You see, Preston, you are not getting the $5,000 relocation fee you so generously offered me. In fact, you are not getting anything at all. Preston opened his eyes and stared down at the legal document resting on the dark slate floor. He reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the pages toward his face. His eyes darted rapidly across the dense legal text, trying desperately to comprehend the absolute financial annihilation outlined in the paragraphs before him. He gasped for air, reading through the permanent, irreversible consequences of his own devastating actions. "I stripped you of the marital home. The historic estate is now my sole property. I stripped you of your entire vehicle collection. My team has already taken physical possession of the cars. You are absorbing 100% of the massive toxic debt generated by your fraudulent real estate investments. You signed the primary loan documents using forged liquidity metrics, making you personally liable for every outstanding balance. I am leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a mountain of federal debt." Preston dropped the decree, letting out a wail of pure agony. He grabbed at his hair, finally realizing he was entering a lifetime of inescapable, crippling poverty. His entire identity had been obliterated in the span of a single morning. The heavy oak door swung open with a crash, silencing his wailing instantly. Harrison entered the boardroom. My father wore a tailored blue suit, radiating a kind of terrifying, effortless authority. He was flanked by 4 security contractors blocking the exit behind him. Harrison walked past a trembling DeAndre and a hyperventilating Richard without so much as a glance. He stopped beside me, looking down at Preston weeping on the floor. My father viewed him with absolute, undisguised disgust. The powerful billionaire did not raise his voice, not even slightly. He simply turned his head toward the lead security contractor. "Remove these trespassers from my building," Harrison commanded, his tone flat and final. The 4 highly trained security contractors moved with fluid, uncompromising efficiency. They did not shout, and they did not brandish any weapons. Their mere presence alone was enough to enforce absolute, immediate compliance. 2 of the men stepped forward and grasped Preston by his upper arms, hauling him off the dark slate floor. His legs gave out completely, unable to support his own weight any longer. He hung suspended between the 2 large men, his expensive suit dragging against the polished stone as they hauled him toward the heavy oak doors. He continued to sob, a pathetic high-pitched wail echoing through the entire glass boardroom. Richard did not require any physical force. He stood up on shaky legs, his face completely drained of color. He looked broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant patriarch who had commanded the country club gala just 48 hours before. He cast one final terrified glance at Harrison before shuffling out the door, flanked closely by the remaining security personnel. DeAndre, the brilliant corporate lawyer who had orchestrated the massive federal fraud from the very beginning, was the last to leave. He walked out with his head bowed low, his career, his marriage, and his entire future now completely, permanently obliterated. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a resounding thud, plunging the boardroom back into pristine, absolute silence. The 5 corporate lawyers gathered their files and exited quietly behind him, leaving my father and me alone together in the vast glass enclosure. Harrison walked over to the windows, looking out over the city skyline stretched below. He turned to face me, a rare, genuine smile softening his typically harsh features for just a moment. "You executed that flawlessly, Naomi," he said, his voice a low, proud rumble. "You did not just survive their attack. You completely dismantled their entire foundation brick by brick. You proved exactly who you are, once and for all." I looked down at the revised divorce decree resting on the petrified wood table. The signature line remained blank, waiting patiently for Preston's inevitable compliance. I did not feel a rush of vindictive joy, the way I had imagined I might. I felt instead a profound and quiet sense of closure. The 10-year experiment was officially over, and the true work of building my own legacy was just beginning. 6 months later, the city air was crisp and bright, reflecting the vibrant energy of early autumn. I stood on the wide stone steps of a stunning Victorian mansion located in the heart of the historic district. The structure had been abandoned for over 2 decades, left to slowly rot by developers who deemed it too expensive to salvage. I had personally overseen the meticulous restoration project from start to finish, funding the entire endeavor through my own private trust. The mansion was no longer a decaying relic. It was now a fully operational, state-of-the-art transitional shelter for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. I wore a tailored emerald green suit, my hair pulled back neatly in a sleek chignon. The dark purple bruise from the country club gala was, by now, a distant memory, entirely erased by time and healing. I looked out over the crowd gathered on the manicured lawn. The local press, city officials, and dozens of community leaders were all in attendance. They were here to celebrate the opening of the shelter and to acknowledge the substantial philanthropic contribution I had made toward its completion. I was not hiding in the shadows anymore. I was standing firmly, unapologetically, in the light. The contrast between my current reality and the catastrophic downfall of my former family was staggering to consider. The financial execution I had orchestrated in that glass boardroom had proceeded with terrifying precision, exactly as planned. DeAndre's arrogant legal maneuvering had resulted in his swift and permanent disbarment. He was currently awaiting federal trial on multiple counts of wire fraud and securities violations. To cover his mounting legal fees, he had taken a job as a low-level paralegal at a discount law firm, forced now to fetch coffee for attorneys he had once considered vastly inferior to himself. Camille and Beatrice, the self-proclaimed queens of the elite social circle, had experienced an incredibly harsh reality check of their own. Their luxury estates were seized by the bank. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked without ceremony. They were currently residing in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Without access to the stolen client funds that had once sustained their lifestyle, they were forced to systematically liquidate their designer wardrobes piece by piece. Beatrice was frequently spotted at high-end consignment shops, aggressively haggling over the resale value of the very vintage silk scarves and diamond-encrusted accessories she had purchased on the morning of their financial ruin. Preston suffered the most spectacular collapse of all. Stripped of his home, his cars, and his once lucrative career, he was saddled instead with the massive toxic debt from his fraudulent real estate investments. The elite social circle he had so desperately worshipped had completely exiled him without a second thought. He was blacklisted from every financial institution in the state. The last I heard, he was working a minimum wage retail job at a suburban home improvement store, wearing a bright orange vest and stocking shelves in the plumbing aisle. His carefully constructed image of power and superiority had been entirely, permanently annihilated. I stood on the stone steps of the newly restored shelter, holding a pair of oversized golden scissors. The mayor concluded his introductory remarks and gestured warmly toward me. The crowd erupted in enthusiastic applause. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that felt, for once, completely natural. I felt my phone buzz gently in the pocket of my emerald suit. I pulled the device out and glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Harrison. The message read, simply, "The foundation is solid. I am very proud of you." I read the words twice, feeling a deep, profound warmth spread slowly through my chest. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked out at the supportive crowd, the flashing cameras, and the beautiful historic building I had personally saved from destruction. I was no longer a victim seeking validation from toxic parasites. I was no longer hiding my true potential simply to appease a fragile man's ego. I stepped forward, gripping the golden scissors firmly in both hands. I was Naomi Harrison, and I was, at long last, the absolute architect of my own empire. The story of Naomi's rise from a humiliated, diminished wife to a commanding architect of her own empire illuminates a profound and lasting lesson. Never shrink yourself to fit into a space that was never meant to hold your true potential in the first place. For a decade, Naomi hid her incredible wealth, her intellect, and her lineage, hoping desperately to be loved for her character rather than her status. Yet, by diminishing her own light simply to comfort her husband's fragile ego, she inadvertently allowed toxic people to exploit her perceived vulnerabilities without consequence. She learned the hard way that shrinking yourself does not, in fact, buy genuine love or respect. It only invites further exploitation from those who prey specifically on the weak. True empowerment begins the moment we stop accepting the false narratives that manipulators project onto us. When Naomi was publicly humiliated, slapped, and financially stripped by Preston and his arrogant family, she did not respond with chaotic vengeance or desperate, tearful pleas. Instead, she calmly reclaimed the identity she had buried for years. She weaponized her quiet observation, her hard-won resilience, and her sharp, patient intellect. Her ultimate victory was not merely dismantling her in-laws' fraudulent financial empire, satisfying as that may have been. It was stepping back, fully and unapologetically, into her own authentic power. She proved beyond any doubt that our value is never determined by those who fail to see it, but rather by our own willingness to stand firmly in our truth. We so often compromise our boundaries simply to keep the peace, hoping our sacrifices will eventually be met with mutual loyalty in return. Naomi's journey reminds us that authentic relationships are built on mutual respect, never on quiet subjugation. When we finally strip away the masks we wear to appease others, we discover, at last, the unshakable foundation of our own self-worth. Take a moment today to honestly evaluate the relationships in your own life and boldly step away from any table where your true worth is not being fully respected.